All right, settle in, you connoisseurs of historical discomfort, because today we're peeling back the velvet drapery of Victorian elegance to reveal something far more sinister, far more constricting. You see those sepia-toned photographs, don't you? Those impossibly poised women, all delicate waists, serene expressions, and mountains of perfectly coiffed hair. They look like ethereal goddesses, don't they? Like living porcelain dolls, existing solely to be admired, smelling vaguely of lavender and quiet desperation. They present a vision of grace, of immaculate femininity, a bygone era where beauty seemed to be a delicate art form, diligently practiced, lovingly displayed. It's an aesthetic that still whispers to us through vintage filters and period dramas, promising a romantic ideal, a timeless charm. But oh, how appearances can deceive. The truth, as it so often is far uglier, more painful, and frankly, a lot funnier in a deeply, deeply uncomfortable way. Because beneath that serene facade, under those layers of silt and lace, pulsed a relentless, often agonizing pursuit of an ideal woman who simply couldn't exist without violating every natural law of human biology. This wasn't merely about looking pretty. This was a full-contact sport of self-mutilation, a marathon of discomfort, and a masterclass in controlled suffering. The Victorians, bless their cotton socks, didn't just set the bar for beauty high. They launched it into low orbit, then booby-trapped the ladder, set the surrounding area on fire, and filled the air with arsenic. The promise was perfection, a flawless embodiment of womanhood, but the reality was a slow, deliberate dismantling of the female form and spirit, all for the fleeting gaze of societal approval. So let's get one thing straight right from the outset. Victorian beauty standards were not merely challenging, like trying to assemble IKEA furniture with a hangover. No. They were a brutal, life-altering, and often deadly impossibility, meticulously designed to control, to confine, and to conquer the very essence of a woman's autonomy. This wasn't about health or genuine happiness. It was about appearance as a moral imperative, a public performance of propriety and subservience enacted through a terrifying array of instruments and chemicals. It was a societal straitjacket, enforced with the precision of a Swiss watch and the cruelty of a medieval torture device. Imagine trying to run a marathon in a diving bell while simultaneously performing brain surgery on yourself. That's roughly the level of challenging we're talking about here. Over the next few hours, we're going to embark on a dark, sarcastic journey. We'll descend into the meticulous misery of 19th century aesthetics, unearthing the literal pains taken to achieve a look that would make modern plastic surgeons blanch. We're going to smell the stale starch, feel the suffocating grip of whalebone, taste the lead in the complexion powder, and hear the gentle creak of a collapsing rib cage. You'll be right there with them, practically smelling the faint ammonia of the latest hair tonic, feeling the pinch of shoes designed for elves, and sensing the ever-present, crushing weight of societal judgment. What exactly can you expect from this delightful historical exposé? Oh, just a deep dive into the physical, mental, and societal costs of being a beautiful Victorian woman. We'll cover everything from the architectural marvels of their undergarments to the literal poisons they applied to their faces, the starvation diets they embraced, and the peculiar illnesses they romanticized. It's a story of impossible ideals, unwavering hypocrisy, and the sheer human capacity for self-inflicted torment, all wrapped up in a pretty, poisoned bow. So, prepare yourselves, because by the end of this, you might just find yourself strangely grateful for yoga pants and breathable fabrics. Or, at the very least, you'll have a newfound appreciation for not having lead in your moisturizer. Now, to truly appreciate the exquisite horror of Victorian beauty standards, you first need to understand the stage upon which this macabre play was performed. Welcome to the Victorian era, a period so utterly brimming with paradoxes, it practically invented the word irony. You had an age of unprecedented industrial might, smoke-belching factories churning out goods at a dizzying pace, steam engines thundering across continents, and telegraph wires beginning to shrink the world. It was a time of dizzying progress, of grand engineering feats, and a relentless march towards modernity, driven by British ingenuity and brute imperial force. And yet, somehow, this very same society insisted on domestic fragility as the ultimate feminine ideal. Women, apparently, were not to be associated with all that bustling, dirty progress. They were to remain delicate, ornamental, and prone to fainting at the mere sight of a strong breeze. Beneath the veneer of progress, strict social hierarchies were as rigid as the steel busks in a lady's corset. Your place in society wasn't merely a suggestion, it was a deeply ingrained, almost spiritual commandment. The crushing weight of public opinion was a force more powerful than any law. A misplaced hem, a slightly too rosy cheek, an improper acquaintance. Any of these could send a woman's reputation plummeting faster than a lead balloon in a well. Reputations, once tarnished, were rarely, if ever, regained, condemning women to a life of social ostracism and often destitution. It was a society obsessed with appearances, where the external presentation was not just a reflection of your character, but often the sole determinant of your character. This brings us to the respectability obsession. In Victorian Britain, appearances didn't just dictate your social standing, they dictated your very worth, your marriage prospects, and, astonishingly, even your perceived moral standing. A woman of good character had to look the part, modest, demure, delicate, and impeccably dressed, but never overdressed, a subtle yet crucial distinction that could land you in social hot water. Your public presentation was a living, breathing advertisement for your family's wealth, your husband's status, and your own unblemished virtue. Fail to maintain this illusion, and you weren't just deemed unfashionable, you were deemed morally suspect, a slippery slope that could lead to being categorized as a fallen woman, a fate worse than death for many. The pressure cooker of public judgment was always on, simmering gently, ready to boil over at the slightest misstep. And how were these impossible ideals disseminated? Why? Through the burgeoning mass media, of course. The 19th century saw the explosion of fashion plates, ladies' magazines, and illustrated novels. These glossy, or rather hand-tinted and rather stiff publications became the insidious spreaders of impossible ideals, reaching into every respectable home, dictating everything from the exact shade of lilac for your morning dress to the precise number of hat pins needed to secure a truly monumental bonnet. Women across the social strata, from the aspiring middle class to the already established elite, devoured these pages, absorbing every dictate, every subtle nuance, every prescriptive image of what perfection looked like. It was the original Instagram feed, but with more corsets and fewer avocado toasts, and significantly higher stakes for not conforming. Adding another layer of macabre fascination to this era was the ever-present specter of disease and death. Tuberculosis, cholera, diphtheria, these were not distant, abstract threats, but terrifying realities that decimated families and communities. Death was a constant companion, touching nearly every household. And yet, bizarrely, this pervasive awareness of mortality often intertwined with beauty ideals in the strangest ways. A pale, translucent pallor, often associated with consumption, tuberculosis, became strangely romanticized, seen as a sign of delicate beauty, of ethereal fragility. It was the ultimate dark aesthetic, where the very signs of a slow, agonizing demise were deemed desirable. This wasn't just superficial. It was a beauty standard with a literal body count, a silent testament to the era's morbid romanticism and its bafflingly unhealthy priorities. So, where did this impossible dream machine even begin? Well, it sprang from the fertile, albeit rather restrictive, soil of Victorian societal pressures and the deeply ingrained gender roles of the time. At the core of it all lay the stark dichotomy of the angel in the house versus the fallen woman. For a respectable woman, your existence was neatly packaged into one idealized box, the angel. This was the chaste, pure, virtuous, selfless, ever-radiant homemaker whose sole purpose was to create a sanctuary of domestic bliss for her weary husband. She was the moral compass, the gentle guiding hand, the soothing balm to the rough and tumble world of men. Her job was to embody all that was good and pure, a living monument to domesticity, a moral beacon flickering softly in the gloom of Victorian industrialism. And if you strayed from that path, even a millimeter, well, then you were the fallen woman. No ambiguity, no middle ground. This was the prostitute, the unmarried mother, the woman who dared to express her sexuality, or, heaven forbid, her intellect too openly. She was the antithesis of the angel, a stain on society, condemned and cast out. This extreme binary left almost no room for female individuality, for ambition outside the home, or for a personality that didn't conform to the meek, subservient ideal. It was a suffocating definition, reducing women to either saints or sinners, with very little in between, and placing an immense psychological burden on every woman to relentlessly strive for the impossible purity of the angel. Within this framework, women's primary role was incredibly narrow: decoration, procreation, and domestic management. You were, essentially, an ornamental piece of furniture, albeit one that could give birth and manage the household staff. Your worth wasn't measured by your wit, your brilliance, or your accomplishments in the public sphere, but by your ability to beautify your home, produce heirs, and oversee the intricate dance of domestic duties. Your appearance, therefore, became paramount. It was your primary public-facing responsibility, a visual representation of your success in fulfilling these prescribed roles. You were a living, breathing billboard for your family's prosperity and propriety, and your physical presentation was the billboard's artwork. And who was the ultimate judge of this living artwork? Why, the male gaze, of course. Unfiltered, unyielding, and utterly central to a woman's sense of worth. Men were the arbiters of beauty, the gatekeepers of respectability, and their approval was the currency of female existence. A woman was groomed, dressed, and presented for male appreciation and validation. Her entire public persona was curated to appeal to these external standards, often at the expense of her own comfort, health, or personal desires. It was a constant performance, a silent plea for acceptance in a world where male approval literally dictated your future, your social standing, and your economic security. Imagine living in a perpetual audition where the only role available is decorative background prop. Because, let's be blunt, for many women, a good marriage wasn't just a desirable outcome, it was the only viable career path. Without the ability to inherit property freely, enter most professions, or even control her own earnings once married, a woman's economic security was almost entirely tethered to securing a suitable husband. And what was the primary tool in this high-stakes matrimonial market? Beauty, of course. Your looks, your deportment, your delicate constitution, these were your assets, your bargaining chips. The more closely you aligned with the prevailing beauty ideal, the more marriageable you became. It was a horrifyingly superficial system, reducing a woman's entire future to the curvature of her spine and the pallor of her skin. It's like a dating app where your profile picture is your entire resume, and the algorithms are controlled by dusty old patriarchs. Finally, lurking beneath all these layers of lace and hypocrisy was a deep-seated fear of female sexuality and intellect. An overt display of either was seen as dangerous, threatening the established patriarchal order. How do you control something so potent? You sublimate it. You channel it. You funnel it into restrictive fashion, into corsets that literally prevented deep breaths, into clothes that made movement arduous, into elaborate hairstyles that required hours of meticulous arrangement and limited physical activity. By physically constraining women, by forcing them into a passive, ornamental existence, society hoped to symbolically, and often literally, constrain their minds and their desires. It was a cage of whalebone and silk, designed to keep the angel in her gilded, domesticated prison far away from any dangerous thoughts of independence. The architect of this elaborate cage wasn't some singular, malicious genius, but rather a sprawling, unspoken consensus built on layers of moralistic dogma, class distinctions, and the fundamental belief in female subordination. For the Victorians, beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was soul deep. It was intricately intertwined with perceived virtue and moral purity. A beautiful woman, ideally, was also a good woman, chaste, pious, modest. Any deviation from the beauty ideal was often interpreted as a moral failing. Too much color in your cheeks? You must be brazen. Too much cleavage? You're clearly inviting trouble. A hint of an unladylike muscular arm? Good heavens, you must be a slovenly worker. Or worse, someone who enjoys physical activity. The external was a direct reflection of the internal, a sort of character ledger displayed for all to see. This led to a curious paradox. Natural beauty was lauded in theory, but utterly destroyed in practice. Magazines and etiquette guides would often extol the virtues of a fresh, unadorned complexion, of simple elegance that sprung from good health and an innocent heart. And yet, every single beauty standard we're about to delve into required extensive, often dangerous, artificial manipulation. You were supposed to look effortlessly perfect, as if you just rolled out of bed with a cinched 18-inch waist, glowing alabaster skin, and a perfectly arranged chignon. The effort, the pain, the sheer artifice involved had to be completely invisible. It was the ultimate no-makeup makeup look, achieved through methods that would make a modern dermatologist faint and a toxicology report sing. Of course, this entire charade was primarily a performance for the privileged. There was a stark class divide in who could afford to be beautiful, and who simply suffered for it. For the vast majority of working-class women, these elaborate standards were an impossible fantasy. They couldn't afford the endless yards of fabric, the custom-made corsets, the array of dubious tonics, or the servants to help them dress. More importantly, they couldn't afford the leisure to be pale and delicate. Their beauty was often dictated by practicality. Sturdy shoes, washable fabrics, hands roughened by labor, faces kissed by the sun. While the rich suffered for beauty, the poor simply couldn't afford the illusion. Their beauty was often a sturdy endurance, a resilience forged in hardship, utterly unromanticized by the upper classes. At the very bedrock of it all was the underlying philosophy that women were, essentially, property. Property to be shaped, adorned, controlled, and displayed. Daughters were possessions to be married off for advantageous alliances. Wives were extensions of their husband's status, and all women were, to a significant extent, defined by their relationships to men. This perspective informed every aspect of female existence, including their physical appearance. Beauty standards became a tool of ownership, a way to mark and manage these valuable assets. You were not dressing for yourself. You were being dressed for the market, for the household, for the public gaze that owned you. It was a slow societal conditioning that permeated every layer of being, reducing women to beautiful, breathing possessions. And if you wanted a scientific justification for this madness, the Victorians were always ready to oblige with their particular brand of pseudoscience. Enter phrenology and physiognomy. These utterly discredited fields purported to link bumps on the skull, phrenology, or facial features, physiognomy, directly to a person's character, intelligence, and moral fiber. So, a high, smooth forehead wasn't just pretty. It supposedly indicated intellectual prowess and serenity. A delicate nose meant refinement. A small mouth suggested demureness. These arbitrary physical traits were given an almost mystical, scientific weight, cementing specific facial features as not just aesthetically pleasing, but morally superior. It provided a convenient, intellectual-sounding excuse for a deeply superficial and controlling system, giving an air of legitimacy to the baseless judgments that underpinned Victorian beauty. It was the original studies show, without any actual studies, just a lot of earnest, misguided men with tape measures and very strong opinions. All right, if you're going to step into the harrowing fashion landscape of Victorian England, you need to understand one immutable truth. Everything, and I mean everything, began with the corset. This wasn't just a piece of underwear. It was the architectural foundation of Victorian beauty, a bone and steel contraption that promised to sculpt your unruly flesh into the very image of feminine grace. It was a marvel of suffering, a testament to human endurance in the face of aesthetic demands. Imagine if your internal organs were a lump of clay, and your goal was to remold them into an hourglass. That, my friends, was the corset's daily mission. It wasn't merely restrictive, it was transformative, an external skeleton designed to override nature itself. And trust me, nature rarely appreciates being overridden. Now, corsetry didn't just appear out of thin air like a particularly uncomfortable fashion genie. Its lineage is long and storied, stretching back through centuries of European fashion. Before Victoria, there were medieval stays, bodices stiffened with reeds or wood, giving a cone-like silhouette. The 18th century brought its own form of jumps, lightly boned, loose-fitting garments that allowed a bit more freedom, or more rigid, heavily boned stays designed to flatten the chest and push it up, creating a rigid, upright posture that screamed, "I am a person of consequence, and also, I cannot bend over." Each era had its own method of bodily coercion, but the Victorians, in their relentless pursuit of progress, perfected it into an art form of exquisite discomfort. They took a good idea, support, and stretched it to its breaking point, literal breakage. The early Victorian era saw the rise of the training corset, and oh, the sheer audacity of this concept. It wasn't enough to simply don a corset as an adult. The ideal woman's body had to be trained from childhood. From the tender age of, say, 6 or 7, young girls were introduced to lightly boned stays, designed to subtly mold their still developing rib cages into the desired shape. Imagine a miniature, less aggressive version of a medieval Iron Maiden, custom-stitched for your prepubescent daughter. The idea was to gently encourage an erect posture and a small waist, preparing the body for the more rigorous cinching that would come with adolescence. It was preventative maintenance for the future torture chamber of high fashion, slowly, deliberately, and quite horrifyingly shaping the body from childhood, brick by painful brick. And what exactly went into these instruments of gentle torture? Oh, just the finest materials, designed to inflict maximum rigidity with minimal aesthetic compromise. You had whalebone, usually baleen from the mouths of whales, meticulously cut into thin, flexible strips that provided robust support and an unyielding structure. Then came steel, introduced later, offering even greater rigidity and durability, though with a tendency to rust and poke through the fabric, adding insult to injury. The busks, those long, flat pieces of metal or whalebone, ran down the front, providing stability and allowing for the garment to be opened and closed. And, of course, the lacing. Hundreds of inches of sturdy cord meticulously crisscrossed up the back, the key to achieving that coveted, suffocating cinch. Each component was a carefully chosen instrument in the symphony of suffering, creating a garment that was both an engineering marvel and a physiological disaster. The initial effects were almost immediate and profoundly unpleasant. As the laces were drawn tighter, you'd feel your diaphragm protesting, your lungs finding it harder to take a full, satisfying breath. It wasn't just a mild restriction. It was a deliberate compression, forcing shallow breathing and a constant, low-level anxiety that probably fueled many a Victorian lady's vapors. Your internal organs, those squishy, cooperative things, were suddenly forced to relocate, pushed downwards, sideways, or simply squashed into unnatural configurations. The liver, stomach, intestines, they all had to find new homes within your increasingly constrained torso. And your muscles? Well, why bother with core strength when a corset could do all the heavy lifting? Muscle atrophy was a given, leaving your torso weak and utterly dependent on that external scaffolding. It was all for a dainty waist, of course, a visual shorthand for delicacy and a constant reminder that you were utterly, beautifully, helplessly incapacitated. As the Victorian era matured, so too did the ambition of corsetry. We enter what can only be described as the golden age of tight lacing, a period where the obsession with an ever smaller waist reached truly ludicrous and often fatal proportions. The ideal wasn't just a slim waist anymore. It was a wasp waist, a dramatic, almost impossible indentation that made the torso appear barely wider than a modern-day forearm. Women aimed for 18 inches, 17 inches, some even boasting of 13-inch waists, a size that, to put it mildly, is less dainty and more medical emergency. This wasn't merely a fashion trend. It was a competitive sport of bodily modification, a silent, agonizing contest of who could push the limits of human physiology the furthest. Imagine trying to shrink-wrap your torso every single day just to fit in a fleeting ideal. It sounds like a bad horror movie premise, doesn't it? Achieving such an extreme cinch was, predictably, not a solo activity. You couldn't just casually lace yourself into an 18-inch prison. It required assistance. Often it was the maid, a long-suffering domestic employee, whose daily duties included literally squeezing the life out of her mistress. Sometimes it was a spouse, presumably one with a strong grip and a peculiar aesthetic appreciation for a barely breathing partner. Or, for the truly dedicated, it was a ritual of intense personal commitment, involving leaning against a bedpost or pulling with all their might, inch by agonizing inch. The process was slow, arduous, and often involved holding onto something solid for leverage, bracing against the inevitable resistance of bone and flesh. It was a daily struggle, a silent battle against your own anatomy, fought with sweat, grunts, and the occasional desperate gasp for air. The purported benefits of such extreme measures were, naturally, abundant and mostly specious. Corsets, proponents claimed, offered support for the back, preventing slouching and promoting a dignified posture. While a lightly boned stay could offer some posture correction, the tight-laced monstrosities of the mid-century actually weakened core muscles, leaving the wearer utterly dependent on the external structure. They were also said to improve posture, forcing the wearer into an unnaturally rigid, upright stance that might look elegant but was incredibly uncomfortable. And, of course, they enhanced the bust, pushing the breasts upwards and outwards, creating a dramatic décolletage that, while visually striking, was often achieved by displacing organs downwards. It was all about creating an illusion, a magnificent but ultimately false sense of perfect form achieved at the cost of genuine physical well-being. The undeniable side effects, however, painted a far grimmer picture. Fainting spells, for instance, became so common they were almost a fashion accessory, a sign of delicate femininity. But they weren't due to innate fragility. They were due to a lack of oxygen, plain and simple. Imagine your brain screaming for oxygen while your lungs are operating at 50% capacity, trapped within a steel cage. Digestive issues were rampant, as stomachs and intestines were compressed and shoved out of their natural positions, leading to chronic constipation, indigestion, and general gastrointestinal misery. Crushed ribs were not uncommon, leading to permanent deformities and agonizing pain. Uterine displacement, a serious and painful condition, was also a frequent consequence, impacting women's reproductive health. This wasn't just discomfort. It was a systematic assault on the human body, a daily struggle against its own design. And for those with a morbid fascination, the era offered plenty of anecdotes of extreme lacing. There were stories, often embellished, but rooted in a terrifying reality, of women dying from internal organ damage, of ribs literally piercing livers, of lungs collapsing. One particularly infamous case spoke of a woman whose 13-inch waist left her with a liver so severely constricted it had a deep groove permanently etched into it, a grotesque testament to her lifelong dedication to the wasp waist. These stories, far from deterring others, often fueled the fascination, creating a macabre sense of competitive dedication. It was a fashion trend with a body count, a whispered, terrifying game of how far you could push your own body before it simply gave up. And yet, the lure of the ideal silhouette remained, an irresistible siren song leading thousands of women down a path of self-destruction, all for the sake of looking pretty. As the century wore on, even the unflappable Victorians started to notice a few minor inconveniences with their beloved corsets. You know, like women dying. So naturally, medical backlash and moral panic began to mount. Doctors, who at first had either ignored or even endorsed corsetry, started publishing increasingly dire warnings. They chronicled the literal fatal consequences: pneumonia exacerbated by compressed lungs, pleurisy made worse by rigid rib cages, fainting spells leading to dangerous head injuries, and the terrifying internal organ damage. Diagrams appeared in medical journals showing livers grotesquely misshapen, stomachs displaced, and spines curved unnaturally, all attributed directly to tight lacing. It was a slow, dawning realization that fashion was quite literally killing people, one cinched waist at a time. The scientific community, though still nascent in many respects, began to fight back, armed with anatomical drawings and grim case studies. Of course, the fashion industry, ever resistant to common sense, didn't immediately throw in the towel. Instead, they offered a compromise, the rational corset. Oh, the sweet irony. These were supposedly designed to be healthier, featuring less rigid boning, slightly looser lacing, and shapes that ostensibly conformed more to the natural body. Some even attempted to redistribute pressure or support the bust and back without such extreme compression. But let's be real, a rational corset is a bit like a gentle root canal. While perhaps marginally less destructive than its predecessors, it still fundamentally imposed an unnatural shape, still restricted movement, and still displaced organs. It was a half-hearted concession, a cosmetic fix to a fundamental design flaw, largely failing to address the core problem of bodily constriction. It was like swapping out the rusty nails in your torture device for slightly shinier ones. Still a torture device. Despite the growing chorus of medical warnings and the occasional horrifying anecdote, the enduring power of fashion over common sense and health remained stubbornly strong. To not wear a corset was, for a respectable woman, almost unthinkable. It implied a slovenliness, a lack of self-respect, an absence of discipline. It was the societal equivalent of showing up to a black tie event in pajamas, simply not done. The aesthetic pull of the hourglass figure, the perceived elegance of the S-bend silhouette, and the sheer force of tradition proved incredibly difficult to overcome. Fashion, in this era, wasn't just about personal taste. It was about conformity, status, and the very fabric of social acceptance. To defy it was to risk social suicide, a terrifying prospect that kept millions of women literally buttoned up. The psychological impact of the corset was just as profound, if not more so, than the physical. Imagine the constant feeling of being held in, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. The corset became a literal embodiment of the societal restrictions placed upon women. It was a constant reminder of their confined roles, their limited agency, and the expectation that their bodies, like their lives, were not truly their own. Every shallow breath, every restricted movement, every aching rib served as a tangible link to their subordinate status. It symbolized their place within the domestic sphere, their ornamental function, and the pervasive expectation of docility. It was a cage, both literal and figurative, shaping not just their bodies, but their very sense of self. The death of the corset was a slow, painful affair, much like wearing one for 80 years. It didn't vanish overnight with a dramatic unlacing. Instead, its chokehold slowly began to loosen at the century's end, partly due to the medical warnings finally sinking in, partly due to the emerging voices of dress reform, and partly due to changing fashion sensibilities that favored a slightly more natural, albeit still very stylized, silhouette. The S-bend corset of the Edwardian era, which pushed the bust forward and hips back, creating a more dramatic, less waist-focused curve, marked a shift. But even then, the corset didn't disappear entirely. It merely evolved, lingering on in various forms well into the early 20th century, clinging to its reign with the tenacity of a barnacle. It finally took a world war and the practical necessity of women working in factories to truly loosen its grip. But its legacy, a silent testament to endurance and exquisite discomfort, would forever define Victorian beauty. If the corset was the internal scaffolding of Victorian fashion, then the crinoline was the external architecture, a marvel of engineering designed to expand the skirt to utterly absurd, yet undeniably fashionable proportions. Imagine turning yourself into a human bell, a mobile fortress of fabric, where your personal space expanded to a radius that made casual conversation a shouting match. That, my friends, was the cage crinoline, which burst onto the scene in the mid-19th century, replacing layers of heavy petticoats with a lightweight, flexible framework of sprung steel hoops. It was a revolutionary invention, offering unprecedented volume without the crushing weight, but introducing a whole new set of problems. It traded one form of torture for another, internal compression for external engulfment. The spectacle of the crinoline was truly something to behold. Women, particularly during the 1850s and 60s, were transformed into grand, ornamental structures, mobile sculptures draped in yards and yards of fabric. They swept into rooms like elegant galleons, their skirts billowing around them, commanding attention and vast swaths of physical space. It wasn't just clothing. It was a statement, a declaration of status and fashion forwardness, a visible manifestation of wealth. Think of all that fabric and leisure. How could you possibly work in that? You weren't just wearing a dress. You were inhabiting a small, fabric-covered tent, a personal ecosystem of silk and hoop steel floating majestically across drawing rooms and ballrooms, often leaving a trail of minor destruction in your wake. But oh, the sheer impracticality of it all. Navigating doorways became a delicate art form, requiring a sideways shuffle and a prayer. Public transport was a nightmare, as two crinolines could barely fit abreast on an omnibus bench, leading to many a frustrated groan from fellow passengers. Basic social interaction became a strategic dance, as you had to calculate distances to avoid swatting gentlemen with your voluminous skirts or knocking over fragile porcelain vases. Sitting down was less a gentle descent and more a controlled collapse, requiring careful management of the hoops to avoid them flipping up around your ears like a startled umbrella. Forget intimacy or ease of movement. The crinoline made every mundane activity an Olympic sport of careful navigation. It was a fashion statement that functionally isolated you from the very world you were trying to impress. And the undeniable dangers? My dear friends, the crinoline was not just a fashion accessory. It was a fire hazard, a machinery magnet, and an aerodynamic nightmare. Imagine standing too close to a roaring fireplace, and suddenly your highly flammable skirt ignites, turning you into a human torch in seconds. This was a tragically common occurrence, leading to horrific deaths. Or picture yourself near rotating machinery in a factory. Though most crinoline wearers were not factory workers, they might encounter it, only for a hoop to get snagged, dragging you into the gears. And then there was the wind. A particularly strong gust could turn your voluminous skirt into a sail, lifting you off your feet, or, at the very least, sending you tumbling into a most undignified heap. It was a fashion that literally threatened to set you ablaze, swallow you whole, or simply carry you away, Dorothy style. The evolution of the crinoline was a fascinating study in adapting impracticality. Early versions were enormous, perfectly dome-shaped, creating a formidable sphere around the wearer. As the 1860s progressed, the shape began to shift. The crinoline flattened in the front, allowing for slightly easier movement, while the volume migrated to the back, creating a graceful, flowing train. This transition was partly a response to the growing practical complaints and dangers, but also a precursor to the next evolution in grand silhouettes. The sheer size decreased slightly by the late 1860s, making it less of a hazardous architectural structure and more of a, well, still quite large and unwieldy, but perhaps slightly less lethal personal perimeter. The crinoline might have shrunk, but the idea of a woman's dress as an imposing, fabric-intensive statement was here to stay. Just when you thought Victorian fashion might, perhaps, consider a fleeting moment of practicality, it merely shifted its architectural ambitions from the broad, all-encompassing crinoline to a more posterior-focused exaggeration. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the bustle, the next grand illusion, designed to shift the volume from your entire circumference directly to your derriere. It was a fashion development that quite literally told women to get their rear into gear, or rather, to create the illusion of a rather magnificent rear, often supported by some truly inventive contraptions. This wasn't just about a bit of tatting, it was about creating a dramatic, almost gravity-defying shelf at the back, giving a whole new meaning to the phrase, junk in the trunk. The bustle wasn't a one-trick pony. It came in various forms, each more inventive than the last. You had the simple padded cushions, like a small, firm pillow strapped to your lower back, providing a modest, rounded profile. Then came the wire cages, intricate constructions of sprung steel or whalebone designed to create a larger, more structured protrusion. These could be subtle or enormous, ranging from a gentle curve to a veritable shelf that jutted out several inches, even a foot or more, from the wearer's body. Later iterations included tiered constructions, some resembling a series of cascading ruffles, others more like an elaborate bird cage designed to house a particularly flamboyant pigeon. It was a constant evolution of how to best and most effectively exaggerate the female form in the most inconvenient way possible. The aesthetic goals of the bustle were quite specific and, honestly, a little bizarre to modern eyes. It was all about exaggerating the curve of the spine, creating a dramatic, almost S-bend profile when combined with the inevitable corset. The front of the gown would be relatively flat, drawing attention to the pushed-forward bust, while the back would explode into a voluminous display of fabric, often draped and ruffled to emphasize the new, prominent silhouette. This created an almost pigeon-chested effect, where the torso tilted forward, further emphasizing the rearward projection. It was a silhouette designed to be admired in profile, to create a sense of movement and drama, a sartorial flourish that proclaimed, "Look at my magnificent back end." And the practical implications? Oh, they were, predictably, still quite a nightmare. While perhaps less prone to catching fire than a crinoline, a large bustle still made sitting a strategic maneuver. You couldn't just flop down. You had to carefully perch, or risk crushing your elaborate posterior contraption, or worse, having it flip up and smack you in the back of the head. Leaning back was a lost luxury. Moving through crowds still presented a challenge, as your extended derriere could easily snag on furniture, doorways, or unsuspecting bystanders. Imagine trying to reverse park yourself into a chair every single time you wanted to rest. It was a constant exercise in bodily awareness and a perpetual battle against the laws of physics, all for a fleeting, often ridiculous, fashion trend. The symbolism of the bustle, like all Victorian fashion, ran deeper than mere aesthetics. It reinforced the idea of a woman as an ornamental object, designed to be viewed and admired, rather than a functional, active individual. The dramatic profile created by the bustle, especially when combined with the corset's restriction, limited swift movement, preventing anything that might be deemed unladylike. It kept women literally and figuratively on display, their bodies shaped into an artificial form that spoke volumes about their societal role, decorative, contained, and perpetually poised for observation. It was a magnificent, absurd invention that further solidified the idea that a woman's body was a canvas for societal expectation, a piece of art to be admired, but never, ever truly free. If you thought the corset and bustle were the whole story, you'd be sorely mistaken. Those were merely the architectural framework upon which the true burden of Victorian fashion was draped, the skirt. And what a skirt it was. We're talking about a sheer volume of fabric that, to our modern eyes, is simply mind-boggling. A single fashionable day dress could require anywhere from 8 to 14 yards of fabric, sometimes even more for evening gowns. To put that in perspective, imagine wrapping yourself in a small sailing ship's mainsail, then trying to navigate a crowded grocery store. All that material didn't just look voluminous, it weighed several pounds, sometimes enough to cause actual physical strain and back pain, even before you added the bustle and corset. It was a sartorial statement that screamed, "I am so rich, I can literally afford to carry a small textile factory on my lower half." The sheer burden of layers beneath that main garment only compounded the problem. You weren't just wearing one skirt. Oh no, that would be far too simple. Beneath the fashion fabric, you'd have an array of petticoats, sometimes 2, 3, or even more, made of cotton, flannel, or horsehair, each adding volume, warmth, and, crucially, weight. These layers serve to smooth the silhouette, provide modesty, heaven forbid a glimpse of an ankle, and help create the desired shape over the crinoline or bustle. But together, they created an insulated prison, trapping heat, restricting airflow, and turning a summer's day into a personal, portable sauna. It was a walking, breathing testament to the idea that comfort was a vulgar, bourgeois concept, utterly beneath a lady of quality. And then there was the impracticality of the length. Victorian skirts were invariably floor length, often with a train that swept majestically behind the wearer. In the pristine drawing rooms of the wealthy, this might have looked elegant. But step outside, onto the muddy, horse manure-strewn streets of London, and your dress immediately transformed into a magnificent, moving mop. It swept the streets, collecting every conceivable form of filth: dust, grime, animal droppings, industrial soot, and whatever unspeakable detritus the urban environment offered up. It wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a germ magnet, a biohazard on legs, a constant reminder of the era's dubious hygiene standards. Imagine your lovely, pristine outfit becoming a walking petri dish every time you stepped out your front door. This led directly to the infamous dirty hem problem, a constant source of frustration for Victorian women and their maids. The hems of these voluminous skirts were perpetually soiled, frayed, and damaged by their contact with the ground. This necessitated constant cleaning, meticulous mending, or, for the less fastidious or more overwhelmed, simply ignoring the inevitable grime. Women often lifted their skirts slightly when walking outdoors, an act known as skirt lifting or dressing, to minimize contact with the ground. But this was a delicate balance between practicality and maintaining decorum. Too high, and you risked showing an ankle, a scandal. Many dresses featured protective braid or velvet sewn to the inner hem, acting as a sacrificial buffer, soaking up the filth before it reached the main fabric, then to be replaced or scrubbed. It was an unending Sisyphean battle against the dirt of the world. The physical effort required to simply move in such attire was immense. Forget running, jumping, or even taking a brisk stride. Every movement was limited, a slow, deliberate glide rather than a natural walk. The weight of the fabric, the restriction of the corset, the sheer breadth of the crinoline or bustle, it all combined to make every step a conscious effort. It was a constant workout just to exist, a perpetual, low-level physical exertion that contributed to the famous delicate constitution of Victorian ladies. Imagine spending your entire day feeling like you're trying to swim through treacle while wearing a weighted blanket. It was fashion as a form of passive resistance training, ensuring that women remained confined, physically exhausted, and utterly incapable of anything resembling a spontaneous burst of activity. Now, let's turn our attention to the extremities, those often overlooked indicators of status and beauty, the hands. For the Victorian lady, the ideal hand was a marvel of delicate uselessness, small, slender, unblemished, and, crucially, utterly unsuited for any form of practical labor. These were not hands designed for churning butter, scrubbing floors, or wielding a pen with any great force. These were hands for holding a teacup, gracefully accepting a calling card, or perhaps, at most, dabbing a handkerchief delicately to a perpetually feverish brow. They were a clear, visible declaration of your elevated social standing, a physical manifestation of your leisure, your freedom from the vulgarity of manual work. The obsession with pale skin extended to the hands with fervent intensity. A bronze or tanned complexion on the hands was an absolute no-go, a dead giveaway that you'd been spending time outdoors, exposed to the sun, or worse, engaging in actual physical activity. Sun-kissed skin was for the working classes, for the dairymaids and the field laborers, whose existence was defined by their toil under the unforgiving sun. For a lady, pale skin on the hands signaled a life of genteel, indoor pursuits, of leisure and refinement. It was a visual marker that you were far too important to be exposed to the elements, your days spent in dimly lit drawing rooms, perfectly protected from anything that might coarsen your delicate epidermis. Gloves, therefore, became a constant, almost ritualistic accessory. They weren't just for warmth or ceremony. They were a protective barrier, a second skin designed to shield your precious hands from the twin horrors of sun and dirt. They also served a vital social function, preventing direct skin-on-skin contact, maintaining a strict code of decorum and modesty. You wore gloves indoors, outdoors, at balls, at picnics, even sometimes during meals, removing them only for the most intimate or practical of purposes. It was an unspoken rule that a truly respectable lady was rarely seen without her gloves, her hands perpetually encased, a symbol of her purity and untouchability. Imagine the sheer agony of wearing kid leather gloves for hours on end, in all temperatures, just to maintain an illusion. The treatment of hands for Victorian ladies was a meticulous, often bizarre routine. They would employ bleaching agents, often containing dubious chemicals, to ensure maximum pallor. Emollients and creams were applied liberally to keep the skin soft and smooth, counteracting any potential roughness. And of course, they meticulously avoided any activity that might, God forbid, roughen or discolor their skin. This meant no gardening without heavy gloves, no strenuous needlework without thimbles and care, and certainly no exposure to anything that might stain or scratch. It was a regiment designed to render the hands beautiful, yes, but also utterly unsuited for anything genuinely useful. Your hands were not tools. They were decorative ornaments, carefully preserved and displayed. Ultimately, the ideal hand was a powerful symbol, a clear indicator of both class and the woman's ornamental status. These delicate, white, and often useless appendages spoke volumes about her husband's wealth, her family's social standing, and her own carefully cultivated idleness. They were a living advertisement for her gentle breeding, her protected existence, and her adherence to the prescribed gender roles of the era. A woman with calloused or tanned hands was not merely unfashionable, she was, by Victorian logic, failing in her duty to embody ideal femininity. It was a beauty standard that quite literally stripped women of their natural strength and capability, leaving them, symbolically and often actually, helpless. While the hands were prominently displayed, albeit gloved, the feet of a Victorian lady were largely an unseen, unheard realm of delicate prisons and invisible agony. The ideal foot was a marvel of miniaturization, small, exquisitely arched, and almost entirely hidden beneath the voluminous folds of skirts and petticoats. It was a part of the body that was rarely seen, never discussed in polite company, and yet, paradoxically, subjected to an intense, excruciating regime of aesthetic perfection. The goal was an almost elfin delicacy, a foot that seemed to barely touch the ground, hinting at an ethereal lightness that defied gravity. This obsession with smallness translated directly into the tyranny of tiny shoes. Victorian footwear, particularly for ladies, was designed almost exclusively for aesthetics, utterly disregarding comfort or anatomical correctness. We're talking about shoes with exaggeratedly pointed toes that squeezed and distorted the forefoot, impossibly narrow widths that compressed the entire foot, and high, often unnatural arches that further cramped the toes and strained the instep. Heels were often small and placed centrally, forcing an unnatural gait, forcing immense pressure on the ball of the foot. These were not shoes for walking, running, or even prolonged standing. They were delicate, ornamental prisons crafted from fine leather, silk, or satin, designed to make the foot appear smaller and more dainty. The results of this sartorial torture were, predictably, devastating for the poor feet. Bunions, those painful, bony bumps at the base of the big toe, became a common affliction, forced into existence by the constant compression. Corns and calluses, often inflamed and agonizing, appeared as the skin protested against the relentless friction and pressure. Hammer toes, where toes become permanently bent at the middle joint, were another frequent deformity, twisted into unnatural shapes by the pointed toe boxes. And general foot misery, a constant, throbbing ache, became an uncomplaining companion of the Victorian lady, a silent testament to the daily sacrifice made at the altar of fashion. It was a world where standing elegantly meant enduring constant, low-level pain. Footwear also followed a strict etiquette, distinguishing between outdoor and indoor shoes, each with its own specific, restrictive requirements. Outdoor boots were often high-laced, sturdy, relatively speaking, and still incredibly narrow, designed to protect the foot from the elements while maintaining a delicate profile. Indoor slippers and delicate low-cut shoes were even more refined, made from softer materials but still adhering to the same principles of smallness and narrowness. You had a specific shoe for every occasion, each one contributing to the ongoing torment of your feet, each one a different tool in the arsenal of elegant discomfort. Imagine a shoe rack that doubles as an exhibit of orthopedic nightmares. The suffering was almost entirely silent. You wouldn't hear a Victorian lady complaining about her feet in public. It simply wasn't done. Such a vulgar display of discomfort would be most unladylike. Instead, the foot pain was a constant, uncomplaining companion, borne with stoic grace, a private agony endured behind closed doors. It was another hidden cost of Victorian beauty, a testament to the immense pressure on women to appear effortlessly perfect, even as their toes screamed in protest from within their tiny, beautiful prisons. The elegance was on the outside. The agony, invisible, was always within. If the corset, crinoline, and tiny shoes provided the architectural elements, then the posture was the living, breathing manifestation of Victorian beauty standards, a graceful curve of suffering designed to impress, constrain, and ultimately incapacitate. The ideal was the infamous S-bend silhouette, pushed forward by the relentless constriction of the corset, which thrust the bust forward and forced the hips and posterior backwards. This created a dramatic, almost theatrical curve to the spine, a languid, often precarious pose that hinted at extreme delicacy, bordering on a perpetual state of readiness to faint. It wasn't natural, it was engineered, a living sculpture of discomfort. The accomplished walk of a Victorian lady was less a stride and more a glide, a carefully choreographed movement designed to minimize any unseemly exertion. Long, unfettered steps were out. Short, mincing steps were in, limited by the sheer volume of voluminous skirts and the tight lacing of the corset. The gait was meant to be elegant, ethereal, almost as if she floated across the floor, rather than truly walking. Any swift, energetic movement would be considered unladylike, perhaps even vulgar. It was a perpetual slow-motion performance, where every step was a ballet of containment, a delicate dance of restraint, ensuring that the wearer never exerted too much energy or, God forbid, broke a sweat. Even sitting wasn't a casual affair. It was a performance in itself. An elegant Victorian lady didn't simply rest in a chair. She posed, maintaining a rigid decorum even while seated. Her back would remain straight, her shoulders back, her hands often clasped delicately in her lap. The voluminous skirts would be arranged around her, creating an impressive display of fabric, her feet, those tortured appendages, neatly tucked away. There was no slouching, no sprawling, no informal relaxation. Every posture, whether standing or sitting, was meticulously controlled, a silent declaration of her good breeding, her self-discipline, and her unwavering commitment to the strictures of etiquette. It was a constant performance, even when no one was explicitly watching. The physical toll of this enforced posture was immense, contributing to a litany of musculoskeletal problems. The exaggerated S-bend, while fashionable, was deeply unnatural for the spine, leading to chronic back pain, muscle strains, and often permanent spinal deformities. The dependence on the corset for support resulted in muscular imbalances, as core muscles weakened from disuse, leaving the body reliant on external scaffolding. Perpetual discomfort was the norm, a constant, low-level ache that pervaded daily existence. It was a beauty standard that quite literally twisted the body into unnatural shapes, sacrificing long-term health for fleeting aesthetic appeal. Ultimately, the societal expectation was that every movement was a performance, every gesture meticulously controlled. From the moment she rose in the morning until she retired at night, a Victorian woman's body was a public display, a constant negotiation between physical discomfort and social expectation. Her posture was not her own. It was a canvas upon which society painted its ideals of femininity, modesty, and subservience. It was a silent language, a visual shorthand that communicated her compliance with the prevailing order. The graceful curve was a beautiful lie, masking a profound and pervasive suffering, a monument to the relentless demands placed upon women to embody an impossible ideal. Having sculpted the body into an almost inhuman silhouette, the Victorian beauty ideal then turned its exacting gaze upon the face, and here the prime directive was utterly clear. Your complexion had to be a ghastly white canvas. We're talking pure, alabaster skin, untouched by the vulgar kiss of the sun or the coarsening effects of manual labor. This wasn't just a preference, it was the ultimate sign of wealth, leisure, and a life lived entirely indoors, far away from anything resembling exertion or exposure. Your skin needed to radiate an almost ethereal translucence, suggesting a delicate constitution, a fragile existence, and an utter lack of engagement with the dirty, sun-drenched realities of the working world. It was a visual shorthand for purity, privilege, and a profound disengagement from anything practical. The terror of tanning was very real and utterly pervasive. A bronze complexion, no matter how subtle, was a horrifying indicator of low status. It was the mark of the working class, the farmhands, the laundresses, the street vendors, whose lives demanded constant exposure to the elements. Or, worse, it was associated with exotic races, implying a regrettable lack of refinement and an unsettling proximity to the uncivilized. For a respectable lady, even a faint blush of sun on her cheeks was a social faux pas, a visible admission of having neglected her duties to remain sheltered and delicate. Imagine living in fear of a sunny day, actively avoiding vitamin D as if it were a plague. Your entire public image depended on maintaining a pallor that would make a modern goth jealous. To achieve this coveted paleness, Victorian women employed a bewildering array of methods. Parasols, those delicate ornamental umbrellas, were indispensable accessories, deployed at the slightest hint of sunshine. Wide-brimmed hats, often elaborately adorned, offered further protection. Indoor confinement was, of course, the most effective method, turning fashionable drawing rooms into dimly lit sanctuaries. But for those whose natural complexions dared to rebel against this milky ideal, there were dubious topical agents. These concoctions promised to whiten and brighten, often containing ingredients that were less beauty secret and more chemical weapon, slowly stripping the skin and, alarmingly, sometimes much more. Indeed, the most infamous of these whitening agents was the widespread use of lead-based makeup. White lead foundation, a concoction often called flake white or ceruse, was applied daily to achieve that flawless, ghostly pallor. This wasn't just a cosmetic choice, it was a slow poison, absorbed through the skin, leading to a host of debilitating health problems. Headaches, memory loss, nerve damage, organ failure, and even insanity were all potential side effects of this daily beauty ritual. Imagine willingly coating your face in a known neurotoxin, day after day, all to achieve a specific shade of white. It was beauty with a body count, a horrifying testament to the lengths women would go to meet an impossible standard. And then there was the bizarre phenomenon of consumptive chic. In an era where tuberculosis was rampant and often fatal, a strange aesthetic emerged around the disease. The pallor, the translucent skin, the flushed cheeks from fever, the bright, languid eyes, these symptoms of a slow, agonizing death became strangely romanticized. A woman who looked as if she might waste away at any moment, delicate and ethereal, was often considered the epitome of beauty. It was a morbid fascination, where illness itself became an accessory, a badge of poetic fragility. You were supposed to appear fragile enough to shatter, on the verge of fading away, a tragic beauty whose very existence was a fleeting, poignant moment. It was the ultimate dark aesthetic, a beauty standard that literally found allure in the signs of impending death. Having achieved a canvas of ghastly white, the next focus was on the eyes, those windows to the soul that, in the Victorian era, were expected to convey a very specific, carefully curated message. The ideal gaze was large, innocent, slightly melancholic, and brimming with passive submission. These were not eyes meant for sharp intellect or fiery ambition. These were eyes designed to evoke pity, to convey delicate sensitivity, and to reflect an inner world of gentle contemplation and unwavering purity. They were the eyes of a doe caught in a perpetually hazy beam of moonlight, always a little wide, always a little soft, always a little unquestioning. This coveted doe-eyed look was, predictably, not always a gift of nature. It was achieved through various, often highly dangerous means. Women would learn to hold their gaze in a particular way, to blink slowly, to avoid direct, assertive eye contact. But for those whose natural eyes lacked the desired wide, glistening innocence, more drastic measures were required. This wasn't about a dash of mascara. It was about altering the very physiology of the eye to conform to an ideal that prized a perpetually dreamy, somewhat detached expression. And here, my dear friends, we introduce one of the most terrifying beauty secrets of the Victorian age, the use of belladonna. Yes, that's right, deadly nightshade. Women would drip diluted solutions of this highly poisonous plant extract directly into their eyes. Why? Because belladonna is a potent mydriatic, meaning it dilates the pupils. This was thought to give the eyes a sparkling or dreamy effect, making them appear larger, darker, and more luminous. It created that wide, almost childlike gaze, that ethereal, slightly unfocused stare that was so prized. Imagine willingly putting a substance known as beautiful lady, from the Italian belladonna, into your eyes, knowing it came from a plant that could, and often did, kill people. It was an aesthetic, high-stakes gamble. The terrifying side effects were, of course, rampant and profoundly damaging. Blurred vision was a given, as the dilated pupils struggled to focus properly, turning the world into a constant soft focus filter. Sensitivity to light became agonizing, forcing women to live in dimly lit rooms or perpetually wear veils and parasols, further reinforcing their delicate, confined existence. And with prolonged use or accidental overdose, actual blindness was a very real risk. The substance gradually damaged the optic nerve, slowly stealing away sight in the name of a fleeting, artificial sparkle. It was a literally blinding dedication to beauty, a choice between perfect vision and perfect eyes. Other, slightly less lethal but still dubious, eye enhancements were also employed. Darkening lashes and brows was a common practice, though the methods were far from today's safe mascaras. Women would use soot mixed with oil or dangerous chemical dyes, often containing lead or other heavy metals, to create a more defined frame for their unnervingly dilated eyes. These dyes could cause irritation, infections, and even lead to hair loss or allergic reactions. Yet they were embraced as essential tools in the pursuit of the ideal gaze. Every part of the face was a battleground, and the eyes, those delicate instruments of sight, were no exception to the chemical warfare waged in the name of beauty. With the eyes set to ethereal and the complexion to ghastly, the Victorian beauty ideal then turned its attention to the mouth, demanding a very specific, often utterly artificial, display of demureness. The ideal lip shape was small, delicate, and naturally, or artificially, pink, hinting at a fresh, innocent purity. These were not lips designed for boisterous laughter, passionate kisses, or outspoken pronouncements. These were lips for gentle smiles, soft murmurs, and discreet sips of tea. It was a mouth that promised quiet compliance, a subtle hint of prettiness, and an utter absence of anything remotely sensual or expressive. The horror of a painted woman was a deeply ingrained societal prejudice. Overt lipstick, the kind that left an obvious mark, was a glaring sign of a prostitute, an actress, or a woman of loose morals. Only those who existed outside the bounds of respectable society dared to openly paint their lips. For a lady, the cardinal rule of cosmetics was that they must appear entirely natural, as if you had simply woken up looking flawlessly perfect. Any obvious sign of artifice was a scarlet letter, a public declaration of your moral depravity and your cheap attempts at deception. So if overt lipstick was out, how did one achieve that coveted rosy pout? Through far subtler and often more uncomfortable methods. Women would discreetly bite their lips to encourage blood flow, creating a temporary flush of color. Tinted salves and balms, made from natural ingredients like beeswax and plant extracts, or sometimes, again, dubious chemicals, could be applied for a very subtle, natural-looking enhancement. Another common trick was to suck on beet juice or rose petals, allowing the natural pigments to lightly stain the lips, creating an almost undetectable tint. It was a delicate dance of deception, where the effort had to be completely invisible, the outcome appearing as if it were simply your natural, innocent beauty. Beyond the color, the importance of teeth could not be overstated. White, even, and well-maintained teeth were a significant luxury, a clear indicator of good breeding, proper diet, and access to some, albeit primitive, form of dental care. A dazzling smile, even a demure one, could greatly enhance a woman's attractiveness and marriage prospects. However, for many, this was an unattainable ideal, as dental hygiene was, shall we say, in its infancy for the masses. Indeed, dental hygiene, or rather the widespread lack thereof, presented a constant and often agonizing problem. Tooth decay was rampant, caused by a diet increasingly rich in sugar and a profound misunderstanding of proper oral care. Toothbrushes, while existing, were not universally used, and toothpaste was rudimentary at best. The desperate remedies for toothaches and decay often involved dangerous extractions by unqualified practitioners, or simply enduring the pain. Many wealthier women resorted to false teeth made from ivory, porcelain, or even human teeth, often taken from the poor or battlefield casualties, which, while perhaps aesthetically pleasing, were often ill-fitting and uncomfortable. So while a pristine smile was an ideal, the reality for many was a mouth full of aching, decaying, or simply missing teeth, a hidden shame beneath that rosebud pout. It was a beauty standard that, once again, revealed the stark differences between the ideal and the grim reality of Victorian life. If the corset defined the Victorian body and lead paint sculpted the face, then hair was unquestionably a woman's crowning glory, her most potent natural accessory, and an undeniable source of endless torture. The ideal was simple, yet monumentally demanding. Long, thick, lustrous, and impeccably styled hair, almost always piled high on the head in an elaborate, gravity-defying edifice. This wasn't just about looking good. It was about demonstrating your commitment to the ideal, your access to time and resources, and your boundless patience for self-inflicted coiffure agony. Imagine the sheer weight of it, the constant tension on your scalp, the hours spent, all for the fleeting gaze of admiration. The symbolic importance of hair in Victorian society was immense, almost verging on the sacred. It was a potent sign of femininity, its length and volume directly correlating with a woman's health, vitality, and often her modesty. Unbound hair was considered scandalous, the mark of a loose woman, or perhaps a bohemian artist utterly devoid of respectability. For respectable women, hair was to be neatly controlled, confined, and impeccably arranged, signaling her adherence to social norms and her disciplined nature. It was even, for some, a symbol of virginity, with unmarried girls often wearing their hair down, but still neat, and married women invariably wearing it up in a more elaborate style. Your hair, in short, spoke volumes about your character before you even uttered a single word. To achieve the sheer weight and volume required for popular styles, chignons, plaits, elaborate coils, and towering pompadours often demanded more than just natural abundance. For those not blessed with Rapunzel-like tresses, supplementation was key. Rats, or hair pads, made from hair clippings, horsehair, or wool, were strategically placed to create volume and shape. False hair, in the form of switches, plaits, and curls, was commonly purchased and painstakingly integrated into the natural hair. These were sewn, pinned, and braided into the existing locks, creating the illusion of luxuriant thickness. So while natural hair was lauded, a lot of what you saw in those portraits was, in fact, a magnificent, artfully arranged deception, a carefully constructed illusion of abundant glory. The struggle of washing and drying such monumental amounts of hair was, in an era without modern conveniences, a monumental task in itself. There was no hot running water on demand, no quick-drying shampoos, and certainly no hair dryers. Washing often involved heating water over a fire, carefully rinsing the hair, sometimes with a diluted ammonia solution to strip oils, and then enduring a lengthy, often uncomfortable drying process that could take hours, if not an entire day. Imagine trying to air dry a small horse's tail in a cold, drafty room, hoping it wouldn't become a tangled, greasy mess before it was completely dry. It was a deeply inconvenient, time-consuming ritual, usually relegated to a specific day of the week, often with the assistance of maids or family members. This leads us to the sheer societal pressure to grow and maintain massive amounts of hair. From a young age, girls were encouraged to cultivate long hair, as it was considered an essential feminine attribute. Cutting one's hair short, unless for reasons of illness or mourning, and even then only discreetly, was seen as a radical, almost masculine act. The expectation was to nurture your hair, to grow it to impressive lengths, and then to dedicate a significant portion of your day, or your maid's day, to its elaborate styling. It was a visible, tangible commitment to the feminine ideal, a declaration that you understood your role in society and were willing to dedicate significant personal resources to fulfill it. Your hair was, quite literally, your burden and your crown. The Victorian obsession with hair extended far beyond merely growing it long. It encompassed an elaborate, often ritualistic, and frequently dangerous daily care regimen. First among these was the daily ritual of brushing. Women were advised to brush their hair with hundreds of strokes, often a full 100 strokes every night, to promote shine, stimulate the scalp, and distribute natural oils from the roots to the tips. This was believed to be vital for health and luster, turning a simple grooming task into a meditative, time-consuming, and rather tedious chore. Imagine spending a significant portion of your evening simply dragging a brush through what felt like a small horse's mane, day in, day out, for decades. It was a devotion to detail that bordered on obsession. To secure those elaborate styles, a veritable arsenal of tools was required. Hairpins in various sizes and materials, bone, tortoiseshell, metal, were essential for pinning up chignons, braids, and curls, keeping every strand precisely in place. Hairnets and snoods, often made of silk or fine lace, were used to contain the hair, especially during the day, ensuring a tidy and modest appearance. Padding and rats, those cunning little hair fillers we discussed earlier, were strategically employed to create volume where nature hadn't quite provided enough. It was an intricate, almost engineering feat to construct these gravity-defying styles, requiring not just skill, but a collection of specialized instruments, transforming a simple head of hair into a complex, multi-layered sculpture. And for those who sought to improve upon nature's gifts, there was a booming market for dubious hair tonics. These concoctions promised everything from accelerated growth to restored color, from eliminating dandruff to curing baldness. The problem? Many of them contained dangerously toxic substances. Lead, mercury, sulfur, and even strychnine were common ingredients, promising miraculous results, but delivering a slow, insidious poisoning. Imagine slathering your scalp with a cocktail of heavy metals, believing it would make your hair grow thicker, only to risk nerve damage, kidney failure, or neurological problems. The desperation for beautiful hair made women vulnerable to charlatans peddling outright poisons disguised as panaceas. Dyeing hair was also a practice, though often more covert than overt, carrying a slight stigma of artifice. Yet, many women sought to enhance their natural color, cover grays, or even achieve entirely new shades. The chemical compounds used were, once again, often dangerous. Vegetable dyes, while less toxic, were often ineffective. Metallic dyes, containing lead or silver nitrates, were more potent but highly damaging to the hair, making it brittle, prone to breakage, and sometimes leaving it with an unnatural greenish tint. Ammonia and other harsh chemicals were also used, irritating the scalp and causing allergic reactions. It was a risky business, a secret vanity, indulged at the cost of both health and hair integrity, all to maintain the illusion of naturally perfect tresses. The danger of hair loss, therefore, became a source of intense anxiety. With all these chemicals, tight styling, and harsh treatments, hair loss was not uncommon. For a woman whose identity and social standing were so tied to her glorious mane, losing her hair was a devastating blow, a source of immense shame and self-consciousness. This anxiety, in turn, fueled the market for even more desperate, often ineffective, and frequently dangerous treatments, creating a vicious cycle of chemical application and physical harm. It was a constant battle, a precarious balancing act between achieving the ideal and literally watching your crowning glory fall out in handfuls. Beyond the elaborate tresses, the Victorian beauty ideal extended its scrutinizing gaze to the forehead, preferring a high, smooth, and serene expanse. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was thought to suggest intelligence, composure, and a refined intellect, qualities admired in a woman so long as they remained passive and non-threatening. A high forehead, unlined and unblemished, framed by impeccably styled hair, presented an image of contemplative grace, a serene intellectualism that was suitably delicate and non-challenging. It was a canvas for quiet thought, not overt expression. The art of the coiffure, therefore, was meticulously designed to frame and enhance the forehead. Hair was almost always swept back and up, away from the face, creating an open, expansive view of the brow. Bangs, or fringes, which might break up the smooth line of the forehead, were largely absent from fashionable styles. They were often considered childish, informal, or even uncivilized, a style more suited to rustic country girls than sophisticated urban ladies. The prevailing aesthetic demanded an uninterrupted expanse, a clear, uncluttered view of the brow, reinforcing the idea of an open, honest, and unpretentious character beneath. This commitment to an open forehead meant that any stray hairs, any wisps that dared to intrude upon the smooth expanse were often meticulously dealt with. There was subtle pressure to pluck or wax the hairline for a higher brow, pushing back the natural hair growth to create a more elevated architectural look. While not as extreme as some modern practices, it was still a deliberate manipulation of the natural hairline, aimed at achieving an even, slightly receding effect that elongated the face and emphasized the brow. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible enhancement, but one that contributed significantly to the overall desired facial aesthetic. However, the unfortunate reality for many women was that genetic predisposition to hair loss, particularly along the hairline, was often mistaken for a personal flaw or a failing to maintain their beauty. Whether it was natural thinning, stress-induced shedding, or damage from harsh hair treatments, a receding hairline was a source of great anxiety. Instead of being recognized as a physiological reality, it was viewed as a personal shortcoming, something to be disguised, hidden, or desperately treated with ineffective and often harmful tonics. The ideal, once again, clashed brutally with the natural variations and realities of the human body. The forehead, therefore, became another silent battlefield in the pursuit of Victorian perfection. It had to be high, smooth, and serene, free from the vulgarity of bangs or the embarrassment of a natural, slightly lower hairline. It was a space that spoke volumes about a woman's breeding, her refinement, and her adherence to the rigid aesthetic norms of the era. Another example of how every minute detail of a woman's appearance was subjected to intense scrutiny and profound, often unhealthy manipulation. And now, for a brief, almost whispered interlude, we arrive at the ears. In the grand tapestry of Victorian beauty, the ears were, for the most part, a feature to be modestly concealed rather than prominently displayed. Unlike some eras that reveled in dramatic earrings or carefully coiffed hair designed to showcase the earlobe, the Victorians largely preferred to keep them out of the limelight. This wasn't necessarily a feature to be manipulated with dangerous chemicals, but rather a reflection of the pervasive Victorian ideal of modesty and discretion. They were simply not meant to be a focal point, an area for ostentatious display or undue attention. Indeed, popular hairstyles were overwhelmingly designed to cover or at least partially obscure the ears. The elaborate chignons, braids, and curls were often arranged low over the temples or swept back in such a way that the ears were nestled beneath layers of hair, peeking out only occasionally or remaining entirely hidden. This was part of the overall aesthetic of demureness and understated elegance, where no single feature was allowed to dominate or draw undue attention. It contributed to the soft, rounded, and contained silhouette of the Victorian head, an elegant frame for the carefully constructed face, without any jarring or distracting elements. Consequently, earring fashion during this period tended towards the subtle and discreet. You wouldn't see enormous hoops or dangling chandeliers. Instead, small, delicate studs, discreet drops, or modest button earrings were the preferred choice, often made of pearls, jet for mourning, or small gemstones. These were elegant accents, not bold statements. They were meant to complement, not to command attention, further reinforcing the idea that the ear was not a primary site for adornment or overt display. It was an accessory, not a centerpiece. This preference for modesty and concealment stands in stark contrast with modern times, where dramatic earrings, multiple piercings, and hairstyles that proudly showcase the ears are common and celebrated. The Victorian approach to ears now seems almost repressive, a further testament to the era's pervasive desire to control and contain every aspect of a woman's body and presentation. It highlights how much societal norms shape our perception of beauty, and how even seemingly innocuous features like ears can become subject to elaborate, unspoken rules. The unspoken implication of this modest concealment was clear. Every single part of a woman's body was subject to scrutiny, evaluation, and, crucially, concealment according to societal dictates. No feature was exempt from the pervasive expectation of decorum and control. Even the ears, which one might consider relatively benign, were not left to their own devices. They were incorporated into the overall aesthetic of contained femininity, a small, subtle detail in the larger mosaic of repression. It was a constant reminder that for a Victorian woman, her body was never truly her own. It was always on display, always being judged, and always being carefully managed to fit an impossible mold. Having meticulously surveyed the tormented canvas of the Victorian woman's body and face, it's time to delve into the veritable arsenal of beauty products they employed. And let me tell you, if your modern makeup bag looks like a collection of carefully curated, dermatologically tested, organic, vegan wonders, then a Victorian lady's equivalent would look like a pharmacy of poisons, a terrifying chemical cocktail designed to inflict gradual, insidious harm. This wasn't about enhancement. It was about transformation through toxic means, a desperate attempt to appear naturally flawless using anything but natural ingredients. The overarching obsession was with improving nature, a fundamental contradiction to the societal condemnation of overt cosmetics. You were meant to appear naturally beautiful, as if you had simply woken up with perfectly pale skin, rosy cheeks, and sparkling eyes. Any obvious trace of makeup was vulgar, a sign of low morals and desperate artifice. And yet, the very standards demanded were so far beyond what nature provided that women were compelled to resort to clandestine, often dangerous means. It was a cruel paradox. Society demanded perfection, but demonized the tools required to achieve it, forcing women into a secret world of dangerous self-improvement. Perhaps the most terrifying example of this was the widespread, if discreet, use of arsenic. Yes, arsenic, the famed poison, was actually consumed by some women for a rosy internal glow and to clear the complexion. These were often sold as complexion wafers or arsenic wafers, promising to give the skin a delicate bloom and a clear porcelain appearance. The belief was that, in small doses, arsenic would invigorate the system, giving the skin a healthy flush and clearing up blemishes. Imagine starting your day by nibbling on a little piece of poison, convinced it's making you look better. It sounds like something out of a particularly dark fairy tale, but it was a horrifying reality for many. The terrifying process of preparing cosmetics at home also speaks volumes about the unregulated nature of the industry and the desperation of the consumers. With commercial products often containing undisclosed, dangerous ingredients, some women attempted to concoct their own beauty solutions, often following recipes found in ladies' magazines or household guides. These DIY dangers ranged from relatively harmless herbal remedies to mixtures involving lead, mercury, or other heavy metals, often sourced from chemists who sold them without proper warnings or understanding of their toxic effects. It was a perilous game of kitchen chemistry, where a slight miscalculation could lead to serious injury or death. The consequences of this chemical warfare waged in the name of beauty were a slow, insidious poisoning. The arsenic wafers, while perhaps giving a temporary flush, led to chronic digestive issues, nerve damage, headaches, tremors, and eventually organ damage and a slow, agonizing death. The lead in complexion creams seeped into the bloodstream, causing cognitive decline, anemia, reproductive problems, and a host of neurological issues. Mercury compounds, used as skin lighteners, resulted in discoloration, neurological damage, kidney failure, and mental deterioration. It was a silent epidemic of suffering, a generation of women slowly being poisoned by their own pursuit of perfection, their vanity turning into their demise, all for an impossible ideal that literally demanded their life. Let's continue our terrifying tour of the Victorian vanity table, because the previous chapter merely scratched the surface of the cosmetic catastrophes. Beyond the arsenic wafers, the most pervasive and insidious of these delights were the lead-based powders and creams. For that desirable alabaster pallor, that ghost-like translucence, women would liberally apply white lead foundation, often mixed with other ingredients like vinegar or oil. This wasn't a one-time application. This was a daily ritual, coating the face in a thick layer of a known neurotoxin. The immediate effect might have been a smooth, even, perfectly white complexion. The long-term effects, however, were a grim litany of cognitive decline, anemia, nervous system damage, skin discoloration, and chronic health issues. Imagine trying to look pretty while slowly, deliberately poisoning your own brain. It was beauty with a severe, irreversible side effect of mental fog and eventual decline. Mercury compounds also found a prominent, if dangerous, place in the Victorian beauty regimen. These were primarily used as skin lighteners and acne treatments, promising to clear blemishes, reduce freckles, and further enhance that coveted pale complexion. Creams and lotions containing calomel, mercurous chloride, or ammoniated mercury were readily available. While they might have temporarily lightened the skin or dried out a zit, the long-term consequences were horrifying. Mercury poisoning could lead to severe skin discoloration, often a telltale gray tint, neurological damage resulting in tremors, irritability, and even madness, as well as kidney failure and hair loss. It was a horrifying trade-off. Clear skin today, brain damage tomorrow. Bismuth, another heavy metal, was also employed for its supposed ability to impart a subtle shine and even out skin tone. Bismuth subnitrate was commonly found in face powders and complexion creams, again contributing to the heavy metal load absorbed by the skin. While perhaps not as acutely toxic as lead or mercury, prolonged exposure to bismuth could still lead to its own array of delightful side effects, including gastrointestinal issues, kidney problems, and neurological symptoms. It was another layer of low-grade poisoning, another silent assault on the body in the name of a superficial, fleeting aesthetic. The Victorian woman's face wasn't just a canvas, it was a slow-motion chemistry experiment. The hypocrisy inherent in this widespread use of highly toxic substances was breathtaking. Women were expected to appear naturally beautiful, to emanate an effortless glow that implied good health and moral purity. Yet, to achieve this natural look, they were forced to covertly use these incredibly dangerous, often lethal substances. Overt makeup was condemned, but the clandestine application of poisons was a necessary evil. It created a world of elaborate deception, where outward appearances were meticulously maintained, while the hidden reality was one of chemical warfare waged on one's own body. The societal pressure for natural perfection was so intense that it drove women to ingest and apply substances that actively destroyed their natural health. This entire cosmetic catastrophe was exacerbated by a profound lack of regulation. The patent medicine and beauty product industries were a wild, unregulated frontier, a free-for-all where charlatans and unscrupulous manufacturers could peddle any concoction, no matter how dangerous, with impunity. There were no FDA approvals, no ingredient lists, no warnings about lead or mercury. Products were often advertised with exaggerated claims, preying on the desperation of women to meet impossible beauty standards. It was a buyer beware market, but one where the beware often came far too late, after irreparable harm had already been done. It was the dark side of industrial innovation, where progress meant new and more efficient ways to poison yourself beautifully. Having discussed the visual assaults on the Victorian body, let us now turn to the olfactory. In an era where bathing was not a daily ritual for many, and laundry was an arduous, time-consuming affair, the perceived necessity of perfume became paramount. It wasn't just a luxury. It was a strategic weapon in the battle against lingering body odors, a fragrant shield against the unspoken realities of 19th century hygiene, or lack thereof. Imagine a world where a good, strong perfume wasn't a choice, but a social imperative. A fragrant declaration that you were, in fact, not emanating the faint aroma of stale sweat, unwashed clothing, and Victorian urban grime. The mid to late Victorian era saw the rise of commercial perfumery, transforming from simple, single floral waters into complex, heavy scents. Initially, lighter floral notes like rose, lavender, and violet were popular, seen as innocent and demure, befitting an angel in the house. But as the century progressed, more sophisticated, often heavier and more complex scents emerged, incorporating musks, civet, ambergris, and exotic spices. These perfumes weren't subtle. They were declarations, designed to make a lasting impression and, crucially, to overpower any less than pleasant background notes. They were elaborate, fragrant cloaks designed to disguise the unmentionable. The symbolism of fragrance was, naturally, heavily codified, reflecting the era's rigid moral landscape. Light, delicate floral notes were for innocent young ladies, unmarried women, or those wishing to project an image of pristine purity. These scents whispered of gardens and gentility. Heavier, more sensual musks and exotic blends, however, were often associated with fallen women, actresses, courtesans, or anyone who dared to challenge the boundaries of respectability. A woman's choice of perfume, therefore, was not merely a personal preference. It was a subtle yet potent social signal, instantly categorizing her in the eyes, or rather noses, of polite society. The irony, of course, was deliciously thick. Perfume was touted as a sign of sophistication, refinement, and cultured taste, an essential part of a lady's toilette. Yet, its underlying function was often to act as a magnificent, fragrant cover-up for less than ideal hygiene. A woman might spend hours meticulously styling her hair and applying her lead-based foundation, but her bathing routine might be far more sporadic. So, while the scent of lily of the valley or heady patchouli wafted through a drawing room, it often masked the faint, unspoken odors of infrequent washing and long-worn clothing. It was a beautiful lie, a fragrant deception, creating an illusion of purity and freshness where none truly existed. Beyond direct perfume, the use of scented sachets and powders within clothing and homes was widespread. Delicate linen sachets filled with dried herbs, spices, or commercially available fragrant powders were tucked into drawers, wardrobes, and even sewn into the linings of dresses and petticoats. These released a subtle, lingering scent, ensuring that even the fabric itself contributed to the overall fragrant illusion. Homes were also heavily scented with potpourri, pomanders, and fragrant oils, turning respectable residences into aromatic fortresses against the smells of the outside world, and indeed, sometimes the inside world. It was a sensory assault on the senses, an attempt to perfume away the unperfumable realities of Victorian life. Having subjected the Victorian woman to external constriction and internal poisoning, the pursuit of beauty also demanded control over her most fundamental biological need, food. The ideal body shape, particularly for the upper and middle classes, was a delicate, almost ethereal slimness, with an extreme emphasis on the tiny waist. This wasn't about health or strength. It was about an almost spectral fragility, a body that seemed barely substantial enough to exist. Imagine aspiring to look like you're constantly on the verge of fading away, a wisp of a woman, delicate enough to be blown over by a strong breeze. While the modern concept of formal dieting culture, with its calorie counting and explicit weight loss programs, was yet to emerge, it was certainly replaced by an array of incredibly restrictive eating habits and an unspoken societal pressure to eat very little. Meals for women were often small, light, and focused on dainty portions. Rich, hearty foods, while enjoyed by men, were often considered too vulgar or too fattening for ladies. This wasn't explicitly called dieting, but the effect was the same: a subtle, continuous form of starvation, often disguised as maintaining one's delicate constitution or simply having a bird-like appetite. This often intersected with the consumption chic we discussed earlier, where an emaciated body was seen as desirable and romantic. The gaunt features, the visible bones, the languid air, these were all associated with the delicate beauty of someone suffering from tuberculosis, which, in its cruel irony, was often a very slow and painful wasting disease. Thus, appearing thin to the point of emaciation could be misconstrued as being aesthetically pleasing, a mark of sensitivity and refined grace. It was a horrifying aesthetic, where the very signs of physical decline were celebrated as desirable traits, blurring the lines between illness and beauty. The link between beauty and fragility was deeply ingrained. A woman's physical delicacy was considered a virtue, a sign of her protected status and her gentle breeding. Eating little, therefore, became a way to maintain this delicate disposition, reinforcing the image of a woman too refined for robust appetites. It further solidified the idea that women were not meant for the physical rigors of the world, but rather for a life of gentle contemplation and delicate adornment. A robust appetite might hint at a robust body, which might, heaven forbid, hint at a robust mind, and we certainly couldn't have that. The reality of this diet of despair, however, was far from romantic. Malnutrition was common, leading to a host of health issues: chronic weakness, low energy, anemia, digestive problems, and a general lack of vitality. Women often felt perpetually tired, prone to fainting spells, which, again, were conveniently considered a sign of delicacy, and struggled with basic physical tasks. It was a life lived in a state of perpetual hunger and low-grade sickness, all to maintain an illusion of ethereal beauty. The cost of this aesthetic, once again, was genuine health and well-being, sacrificed at the altar of a societal ideal that prized fragility over genuine strength. Just as diet was dictated by aesthetics, so too was exercise, or rather, the strictures against it for Victorian women. Vigorous physical activity was a gentleman's privilege and a lady's peril, considered utterly unladylike, unbecoming, and potentially damaging. The thought of a woman sweating, exerting herself, or developing anything resembling masculine muscles was met with horror and condemnation. Her body was meant to be soft, yielding, and delicate, not strong or athletic. Imagine being told that physical exertion would literally make you less feminine, less desirable, and perhaps even unmarriageable. The only truly acceptable form of exercise for a respectable lady was a gentle walk, often taken in a carefully cultivated garden or a sedate park, always accompanied and always performed in the full, elaborate, and utterly restrictive clothing of the day. A brisk pace was frowned upon. A leisurely stroll was the order. The goal wasn't to burn calories or build stamina, but to get a little fresh air, without tanning, of course, and to be seen engaging in a suitably refined activity. Imagine attempting a workout while wearing a corset, a bustle, and several pounds of skirt. It sounds less like exercise and more like a carefully controlled form of self-torture. The fear of masculine muscles was a powerful deterrent against any strenuous activity. A woman's body was meant to be soft and yielding, devoid of any visible signs of strength or physical prowess. Muscles implied labor, exertion, and an unfortunate degree of independence, all qualities antithetical to the angel in the house ideal. Therefore, any activity that might develop biceps or even faintly sculpt a calf was to be avoided at all costs. It was a beauty standard that actively discouraged physical health and strength, preferring instead a state of genteel physical frailty. The impact on health, unsurprisingly, was significant. The lack of vigorous exercise, combined with restrictive clothing and often inadequate nutrition, led to weak muscles, poor circulation, and a general state of physical frailty. Women often suffered from sluggishness, digestive problems, again, the corset didn't help, and a pervasive lack of energy. This fragility, ironically, was often celebrated as a sign of delicate breeding, further reinforcing the unhealthy cycle. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, where women were made frail by their lifestyle, and then their frailty was lauded as a virtue. Towards the very end of the century, a glimmer of rebellion emerged with the sudden yet brief popularity of cycling. The safety bicycle allowed women a degree of freedom and mobility previously unheard of, offering a genuine form of exercise. But even this was met with fierce controversy. Critics decried it as unfeminine, dangerous, and leading to moral decay, and something called bicycle face, a supposed grimacing caused by exertion. Dress reformers championed rational dress for cycling, allowing for more freedom of movement, but this was a radical notion, met with ridicule. Despite the initial backlash, cycling marked a small, yet significant, step towards greater physical freedom for women, a crack in the wall of enforced idleness, signaling a slow, painful shift in attitudes towards female physical activity. In a world where beauty was paramount, health was often secondary, and regulations were practically non-existent, a booming market for health and beauty remedies exploded across Victorian society. These were the infamous patent medicines and quack cures, often little more than snake oil, narcotics, alcohol, or, you guessed it, heavy metals. They promised miraculous transformations, instant cures for every ailment from consumption to bad skin, preying on the desperation of a public grappling with high mortality rates, limited medical knowledge, and the relentless pressure to look perfect. Weight loss pills, for example, were incredibly popular, preying on the desire for that ethereal slimness. These often contained laxatives, diuretics, or even tapeworm eggs, yes, really, promising a rapid reduction in size. The laxatives and diuretics led to dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and severe digestive distress, making women feel sick and weak, which was, ironically, often interpreted as successful delicacy. The tapeworm pills, of course, presented a horrifying, parasitic path to slimness, leading to severe malnutrition and potentially fatal complications. It was a barbaric, dangerous approach to weight management, reflecting the era's medical ignorance and the ruthlessness of the market. Complexion wafers, as we briefly touched upon, were another common and deadly example. These arsenic-laced tablets promised a clear, radiant glow, a translucent pallor free from blemishes. In the short term, they might indeed have a temporary effect on skin tone, but at the cost of chronic poisoning, leading to headaches, tremors, gastrointestinal issues, and eventual organ damage. The marketing played on the desire for natural beauty, convincing women that these dangerous concoctions were simply internal cleansers that would make their beauty shine from within. The gullibility of a desperate public was immense. Faced with overwhelming societal pressures, a lack of credible medical information, and the persuasive, often misleading advertising of these cures, many women were easy prey for charlatans and their dangerous elixirs. Testimonials, often fabricated or paid for, filled newspapers and magazines, convincing readers of the miraculous efficacy of these potions. The desire for a quick fix, a magical solution to their beauty woes, blinded many to the obvious dangers, leading them down a path of self-medication with highly toxic substances. The profound lack of medical understanding contributed significantly to the problem. Doctors often lacked the knowledge or the tools to effectively diagnose and treat many illnesses, leaving a vacuum that quacks were all too happy to fill. The scientific method was still evolving, and the concept of rigorous clinical trials was a distant future. Therefore, claims of efficacy were rarely, if ever, substantiated, and the understanding of long-term side effects was almost non-existent. It was a perfect storm of desperation, ignorance, and greed, turning the pursuit of beauty into a dangerous gamble with one's very life. In a truly bizarre twist of Victorian aesthetics, illness itself became romanticized, cultivated, and even performed as a display of delicate beauty. The consumptive chic, as we've explored, was particularly prevalent. Tuberculosis, a devastating and widespread disease, was paradoxically admired for its aesthetic qualities: the pale, translucent skin, the flushed cheeks, a sign of fever, the unnervingly bright and languid eyes, often due to fever and belladonna. A woman who looked as if she were slowly wasting away, fragile and ethereal, was considered the epitome of a tragic, poetic beauty. It was a macabre fascination with illness, where the signs of impending death were transformed into an eerie, almost spiritual allure. Fainting, or the vapors, was not just a symptom of physiological distress, often caused by tight lacing. It became an almost artful performance, a sign of extreme delicacy and sensitivity. A well-timed swoon could interrupt an uncomfortable conversation, demonstrate a woman's fragile constitution, or simply draw attention to her exquisite sensitivity. It wasn't just physical weakness, it was a social ritual, a silent declaration of one's refined nature. Young women would sometimes even practice collapsing gracefully, ensuring their fall was elegant and their posture maintained a degree of dignity, even in unconsciousness. It was a bizarre form of passive performance art, a weapon of feminine fragility deployed for social effect. The vapors, a catch-all term for female ailments, often psychosomatic in nature, were intrinsically linked to emotional fragility and the supposedly delicate female nervous system. These vapors could manifest as hysteria, anxiety, depression, or general malaise, and were often attributed to the inherent weakness of the female sex. It was a convenient medicalization of female discontent, a way to pathologize any deviation from the calm, subservient ideal. Rather than acknowledging genuine unhappiness or the physical toll of their lives, doctors and society at large attributed these symptoms to an innate female instability, further reinforcing the narrative of women as inherently weaker and more susceptible to emotional distress. The appeal of appearing frail and dependent was deeply rooted in the angel in the house ideal. A delicate, sickly woman reinforced the image of a creature needing protection, a fragile flower requiring constant male care and support. It served to amplify male chivalry and dominance, making men feel strong and necessary. This aesthetic of frailty wasn't just about looking a certain way. It was about embodying a specific role, a visual declaration of one's helplessness and reliance on patriarchal structures. It was a strategic performance of vulnerability, designed to elicit protection and reaffirm gender roles. The grim reality, however, was that this romanticization of genuine illness often masked true suffering, leading to neglected health. A woman displaying symptoms of an actual ailment might be dismissed as merely having the vapors or adopting consumptive chic, delaying or preventing proper medical diagnosis and treatment. Real physical and mental health issues were often overlooked or misinterpreted through the lens of this aesthetic. It was a profoundly dangerous cultural phenomenon where the desire to conform to a perceived ideal of fragility literally cost women their health and sometimes their lives, all for a fleeting, morbidly beautiful illusion. Beyond the monumental garments and the dangerous cosmetics, Victorian beauty was meticulously curated down to the tiniest details, each accessory serving as both an adornment and another subtle tool of oppression. These were not just functional items. They were symbols, tools, and further layers of the gilded cage. First, let's talk about gloves. Essential, ubiquitous, and deeply symbolic. They weren't just for warmth or cleanliness, they were crucial for modesty, preventing the sun from tanning precious skin and avoiding direct contact with the unclean world. A respectable lady was rarely, if ever, seen without gloves, whether indoors or out. They covered the hands, those delicate indicators of leisure, protecting them from anything that might coarsen or tan them. In social settings, they prevented direct skin-to-skin contact, maintaining a strict code of decorum and signaling a woman's untouchable purity. Imagine living in a constant state of glove-wearing, an invisible barrier between you and the physical world, all to uphold an ideal of pristine, unblemished daintiness. Then there were fans, far more than simple cooling devices. They were complex instruments in the elaborate dance of flirtation and social signaling. A woman could convey a myriad of messages with a fan. Closing it slowly might signal, "I love you." Opening it rapidly might mean, "I am engaged." And waving it quickly might imply, "I am agitated." This unspoken language allowed women a subtle means of communication in highly restrictive social environments, giving them a degree of agency, however small, within their ornamental roles. But even this small freedom came with a prescribed etiquette, a precise dictionary of movements, turning a simple accessory into a performative tool. Parasols were another crucial accessory, not just for style, but for protecting that precious, pale complexion from the sun's harsh rays. As we've established, a tan was a social death sentence, a mark of the working class. Therefore, a parasol was an indispensable shield, deployed at the slightest hint of sunshine. Made of delicate silk or lace, often adorned with frills and embroidery, they were elegant necessities, further emphasizing a woman's delicate nature and her protected, indoor-oriented existence. They were a constant reminder of the intense pressure to maintain an artificial pallor, transforming a simple walk in the park into a strategic mission to avoid the sun. Hats, of course, were monumental statements in themselves. Elaborate, often towering constructions, adorned with feathers, sometimes entire stuffed birds, which is delightfully macabre, ribbons, flowers, and lace, they were declarations of status, fashion-forwardness, and often the wearer's wealth. A woman's hat was a public display, drawing the eye upwards, completing the overall silhouette. They were less about practicality and more about projection, turning the head into a mobile billboard for sartorial ambition. Imagine trying to keep one of these precarious, bird-laden structures balanced on your head, especially on a windy day, all while navigating a bustling street in a crinoline. Finally, jewelry, while often symbolic and sentimental, was rarely practical. Lockets with beloved's hair, elaborate brooches, delicate necklaces, these were all pieces meant for display, for quiet contemplation, or for signaling marital status or mourning. They were adornments, not functional items, further cementing the idea of a woman as an object to be beautifully decorated, her primary purpose to be aesthetically pleasing. Every accessory, every tiny detail contributed to the grand illusion, reinforcing the idea that a woman's entire existence was a meticulous performance, a gilded cage built with thousands of exquisitely crafted, uncomfortable, and often dangerous details. We've toured the physical manifestations of Victorian beauty, but now it's time to tally the grim cost, to truly understand the deeper cuts these impossible standards inflicted. This wasn't just about discomfort. It was about widespread health deterioration and, tragically, early mortality. Let's summarize the physical harm, because it's a litany that would make any modern doctor blanch. First, the respiratory issues were endemic. Tight lacing, with its relentless compression of the rib cage and displacement of internal organs, severely restricted lung capacity. Women were forced to take shallow breaths, leading to chronic shortness of breath, reduced stamina, and increased susceptibility to respiratory infections like pneumonia and pleurisy. Imagine living your entire life feeling like you're perpetually holding your breath, your lungs never quite filling to capacity. It's a debilitating existence, draining you of energy and making you vulnerable to every cough and cold that swept through the notoriously unhealthy Victorian cities. Then came the digestive problems, a direct consequence of corsetry and restrictive eating. Stomachs were compressed and pushed upwards, intestines were shoved downwards, leading to chronic indigestion, heartburn, and severe constipation. The lack of proper physical activity, combined with often inadequate nutrition, further exacerbated these issues, turning every meal into a potential source of discomfort and misery. The body, constantly battling against its own natural functions, struggled to process food efficiently, leading to a perpetual state of gastrointestinal distress. Musculoskeletal damage was also rampant. The S-bend posture, enforced by corsets, placed unnatural stress on the spine, leading to chronic back pain, nerve impingement, and even permanent spinal deformities. Core muscles atrophied from disuse, leaving women utterly dependent on their corsets for support, further weakening their bodies. Foot deformities, bunions, corns, hammer toes, were a constant source of agony, making every step a painful reminder of fashion's cruelty. Chronic pain, a silent, pervasive companion, was the norm for many Victorian women, an unseen burden beneath their elegant gowns. And tragically, these issues contributed to early death. Conditions like pneumonia, exacerbated by limited lung capacity, became far more dangerous. Prolapsed organs, forced out of position by constant compression, led to severe health complications and increased mortality during childbirth. The danger of tight clothing extended beyond internal damage. Fainting spells, often induced by lack of oxygen, could lead to serious head injuries from falls. For those who survived, the long-term effects of heavy metal poisoning from cosmetics, lead, mercury, arsenic, caused a slow, insidious decline, leading to cognitive impairment, kidney failure, neurological disorders, and a shortened lifespan. The pursuit of beauty truly was a death sentence for many. This created a silent epidemic of suffering behind closed doors. While outwardly appearing demure and perfectly poised, Victorian women endured a daily regimen of pain, discomfort, and gradual physical decline. Their elegant facades hid a brutal reality, a world where the female body was systematically broken down in the name of an impossible aesthetic. It was a horrifying testament to the power of societal pressure, where women were literally sacrificing their health, their vitality, and their very lives for an ideal that prioritized superficial appearance over fundamental well-being. The physical toll was undeniably immense, but the true insidious cruelty of Victorian beauty standards cut far deeper, creating a mental cage that trapped women in a perpetual state of anxiety, depression, and often outright mental illness. This wasn't just about looking a certain way. It was about an entire worldview designed to cultivate psychological distress. Imagine the constant pressure to conform, to be relentlessly perfect. Every aspect of a woman's appearance, from the smallest curl of her hair to the precise cinch of her waist, was subject to intense scrutiny and judgment. Failure to meet these impossible standards wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was a moral failing, a mark of low status, and a threat to her marriage prospects and social standing. This created an omnipresent anxiety of never being enough, a nagging fear that permeated every social interaction and every glance in the mirror. It was an internal, self-perpetuating torture, a constant feeling of being under surveillance, weighed, and found wanting. Compounding this was the pervasive isolation of the domestic sphere. For many respectable middle and upper-class women, their world was confined to the home, with limited intellectual stimulation and constant judgment from within their own households and extended social circles. While men went out into the bustling world of business and ideas, women were expected to remain within their gilded cages, managing the household, raising children, and maintaining their ornamental perfection. This lack of engagement, coupled with physical confinement, led to profound boredom, intellectual stagnation, and a sense of purposelessness, all fertile ground for depression and feelings of entrapment. It is in this context that we see the alarming rise of hysteria as a prevalent female diagnosis. Hysteria, a catch-all term for a vast array of symptoms, including anxiety, depression, unexplained physical pains, irritability, and emotional outbursts, was often a manifestation of profound societal repression and discontent. Women, literally and figuratively constrained, with no outlet for their intelligence, ambition, or frustration, often express their distress through these nervous disorders. Doctors, largely misunderstanding the psychological roots of these conditions, often prescribed rest cures, further isolating them, or even more bizarre treatments that further stripped women of their agency. It was the institutionalization of female unhappiness, framed as a medical condition rather than a social symptom. The emotional toll of constant physical discomfort and restricted movement cannot be overstated. Imagine the subtle yet pervasive irritation of a tight corset, pinching shoes, and heavy, voluminous clothing, day in and day out for decades. This constant, low-level physical agony contributed significantly to irritability, fatigue, and a general sense of malaise, which in turn could exacerbate anxiety and depression. Your body, meant for freedom and movement, was a constant source of pain and confinement, turning against you in its protest, and your spirit, trapped within it, suffered alongside. Ultimately, the Victorian woman faced a profound lack of agency and control over her own body and life. Her appearance was dictated, her movements restricted, her thoughts often dismissed, and her very existence framed within a narrow, patriarchal ideal. This pervasive lack of autonomy, the feeling of being a decorative possession rather than a self-determining individual, fostered a deep sense of powerlessness. It was a mental cage forged from societal expectation and enforced by the very tools of beauty, leaving many women in a state of quiet despair, their minds as constricted as their waists. While we've spent a considerable amount of time dissecting the tortures of Victorian beauty, it's crucial to acknowledge a profound truth. These elaborate, brutal standards were almost exclusively designed for, and endured by, the leisured upper and middle classes. The vast majority of Victorian women, the working class, lived in an entirely different and often far harsher reality where such ideals were an impossible, often laughable fantasy. For the working class woman, maintaining a pale, delicate complexion, unblemished hands, and an impossibly tiny waist was utterly out of the question. Their lives demanded outdoor labor, whether in fields, factories, or simply walking to and from their daily toil. Tan skin, therefore, was not a social failing. It was an unavoidable reality, a mark of a life spent under the sun, earning a living. Strong, capable hands, often calloused and roughened by hard work, were a necessity, not a flaw. These were women who used their bodies for survival, not for ornamental display. The ideal of delicate uselessness was an insult to their very existence. Their clothing, by necessity, had to be practical. Imagine a factory worker trying to operate machinery in a crinoline and a tightly laced corset. It's not just impractical, it's a death wish. Working women wore sturdy, durable fabrics, often dark to hide grime, and cut to allow for freedom of movement. Their shoes were designed for walking and standing, not for making their feet appear delicate. While they might still wear some form of supportive undergarment, it was far from the extreme tight-lacing of the elite. Their fashion priorities were dictated by economic necessity and the demands of their jobs, not by the fickle dictates of Parisian fashion plates. This stark contrast often fueled aspirations and imitations. Working women, exposed to the ideals of respectability and beauty through magazines and observation of the upper classes, might attempt to emulate these standards, albeit with significant compromises. They would purchase cheaper, often dangerous, substitutes for cosmetics, powders containing lead, tinctures with questionable ingredients, hoping to achieve a lighter complexion. They might wear less restrictive but still uncomfortable corsets, or add padding to their skirts to mimic a fashionable silhouette. These imitations were often a desperate attempt to gain a foothold in a society that judged so heavily on appearance, a desire for a sliver of the respectability that wealth afforded. This created a unique dilemma for the respectable working woman. She had to balance the harsh realities of survival, the need to work, to be practical, to endure, with the crushing weight of societal expectations. How could she look respectable and virtuous when her very existence demanded a defiance of those aesthetic norms? She couldn't afford the luxury of leisure, nor the intricate, expensive clothes. She occupied a precarious middle ground, often judged harshly by both the upper classes for her lack of refinement, and sometimes even her own class, for any perceived attempts to rise above her station. Her struggle was not just for economic survival, but for social acceptance within an unforgiving system. So, while we delve into the grotesque glamour of Victorian beauty, it's vital to remember that this was a specific, class-bound form of suffering. For the vast majority of women, life was a struggle against poverty, disease, and relentless labor, not against the confines of a whalebone cage. Their beauty was of a different kind, the resilience of survival, the strength of enduring, a beauty forged in the fires of necessity, largely unseen and uncelebrated by those who dictated the impossible ideals. Just when you thought the adults had cornered the market on bodily torture, let's pivot to the truly alarming Victorian child beauty standards. Because, naturally, the relentless pursuit of an impossible ideal wasn't reserved solely for grown women. It began terrifyingly young. There was a prevalent and rather disturbing trend of dressing children, particularly girls, in scaled-down versions of adult fashions, transforming them into miniature, often uncomfortable, adults in training. This wasn't about celebrating childhood innocence. It was about preparing them for a life of aesthetic conformity from the cradle. Perhaps the most egregious example of this early indoctrination was the use of corsets for children. Yes, you heard that correctly. Training corsets, lightly boned and designed to guide the developing body, were sometimes introduced to girls as young as 6 or 7. The idea was to gently mold the rib cage, to prevent bad posture, and to ensure that a naturally small waist was cultivated from an early age, making the eventual adult tight-lacing less of a struggle. Imagine a child's still developing bones and organs being subtly yet persistently reshaped to fit a preconceived ideal. It was a lifelong constriction, a lesson in bodily control that began before they even understood the concept of vanity. This approach actively suppressed childish play and freedom for the sake of decorum and appearance. Children, especially girls, were expected to be miniature ladies, sitting gracefully, moving demurely, and avoiding any boisterous activities that might dishevel their elaborate outfits or damage their delicate accessories. Their clothing, with its long skirts, multiple layers, and restrictive undergarments, actively hindered natural movement, turning running and jumping into perilous acts. Childhood, a period meant for uninhibited exploration and physical development, was curtailed, sacrificed at the altar of early social conditioning and aesthetic conformity. The pervasive focus was on presenting children, particularly girls, as miniature versions of the ideal adult woman. Their hair was often styled in elaborate curls and updos, requiring hours of brushing and pinning. Their dresses mirrored the latest adult fashions, complete with tiny bustles or crinoline frames, and their demeanor was expected to be one of quiet deference. There was a strong emphasis on cleanliness, neatness, and a general air of subdued prettiness, all designed to make them appealing, tiny reflections of their mothers, future embodiments of the angel in the house ideal. It was a relentless pressure to grow up fast, to skip the messy, joyful stages of childhood and leap straight into the rigid strictures of adult femininity. The physical and psychological harm inflicted on these developing bodies and minds was profound. Physically, corsetry and restrictive clothing could hinder proper development of internal organs, weaken muscles, and lead to lifelong postural issues. Psychologically, the constant pressure to conform, the suppression of natural childish instincts, and the emphasis on external appearance over inner well-being could foster anxiety, self-consciousness, and a distorted body image from a very young age. It taught girls that their worth was tied to their appearance, that their bodies were not their own, but rather projects to be molded and controlled. It was a cruel inheritance, passed down from generation to generation, ensuring that the next cohort of Victorian women would be just as brutally constrained as the last. Beyond the physical contortions and the mental distress, Victorian beauty standards were profoundly embedded within the cult of domesticity, acting as a powerful, insidious tool for social control. This wasn't just about fashion. It was about maintaining a deeply unequal social order, where a woman's beauty literally reinforced her subservient position. The separate spheres ideology was the bedrock of this system. Men in the public sphere of work, politics, and intellectual life, women in the private sphere of the home, family, and moral purity. Women were considered the moral guardians of the home, creating a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the industrial world. But this sanctuary was also a cage. And within this cage, beauty became a primary form of capital for women. It was their currency, their means of attracting a husband, securing their position, and earning the admiration and control of their male counterparts. Her beauty was not for herself. It was for the maintenance of the male sphere, a testament to his wealth and her appropriate domesticity. This led to the explicit expectation that women existed primarily for male pleasure and adornment. A woman's carefully crafted appearance was a reflection of her husband's status, a beautiful possession to be admired, a living trophy to his success. She was a decorative element in his life, a testament to his good taste and financial prowess. Her value was often intrinsically linked to her ability to fulfill this ornamental role, to be perpetually pleasing to the male gaze. This perspective stripped women of their intrinsic worth, reducing them to objects whose primary function was to be seen, admired, and possessed. The ingenious cruelty of Victorian beauty standards lay in their ability to keep women subservient, physically incapacitated, and utterly reliant on men. Corsets restricted movement and breathing, making strenuous activity difficult, if not impossible. Voluminous skirts trapped women in a limited radius, hindering their ability to navigate the public sphere independently. The demands of elaborate hair and makeup consumed vast amounts of time, leaving little for intellectual pursuits or civic engagement. Illness, real or feigned, reinforced their delicate, dependent status. Physically, mentally, and financially, these standards ensured women remained confined to the domestic sphere, incapable of challenging the male-dominated world outside. Finally, there was a subtle, yet incredibly powerful, connection between physical appearance and perceived moral rectitude. A woman who looked beautiful, according to these standards, pale, delicate, modest, perfectly composed, was assumed to be virtuous, chaste, and morally pure. Any deviation, any hint of overt makeup, an unlaced corset, a sun-kissed cheek, was quickly interpreted as a moral failing, a sign of laxity, or worse, depravity. This weaponized beauty, turning aesthetic choices into moral judgments, forcing women into a constant, anxious performance of purity. It was a system designed to control every aspect of a woman's being, from her literal breath to her deepest sense of self, all under the guise of an ideal that was anything but. But even the most formidable cages eventually develop cracks. And as the Victorian era progressed, whispers of rebellion against this oppressive aesthetic began to emerge. Enter the dress reform movement, a brave, if initially ridiculed, glimmer of freedom that dared to challenge the very fabric of female subjugation. These early activists, often associated with burgeoning spiritualism, temperance, or women's rights movements, recognized that the physical constraints of fashion were inextricably linked to the social and political constraints on women. They saw the corset not just as an article of clothing, but as a literal emblem of female oppression, a symbol of a life lived in constant, deliberate restriction. The most famous, or perhaps infamous, manifestation of this rebellion was the Bloomer movement, spearheaded by Amelia Bloomer. Her radical notion? Trousers for women. Yes, imagine the sheer scandal. Bloomers were loose-fitting trousers, gathered at the ankle, worn under a shorter skirt or tunic. They allowed unprecedented freedom of movement, a revolutionary concept for women accustomed to being encased in layers of fabric. Amelia Bloomer herself wore them, advocating for their practicality, health benefits, and their symbolic power in liberating women from the physical bonds of fashion. It was a brave, bold step, a sartorial declaration of independence that, while initially met with outrage, laid crucial groundwork for future fashion revolutions. Predictably, the Bloomer movement, and indeed all dress reformers, faced intense ridicule and social ostracism. Cartoons depicting women in bloomers as masculine, ugly, or politically radical filled newspapers and satirical magazines. They were mocked as unsexed, accused of abandoning their femininity, and threatening the very foundations of society. Imagine being subjected to public scorn and ridicule merely for wanting to breathe freely and walk without tripping over your own skirt. It required immense courage to stand against such a powerful tide of social disapproval, to endure the laughter and the condemnation, all for the sake of a more rational, healthier way of dressing. Despite the backlash, the movement slowly gained traction, pushing for rational dress. This wasn't necessarily about radical trousers for everyone, but about promoting healthier alternatives, looser corsets, less voluminous skirts, and more practical clothing that allowed for greater comfort and freedom of movement. Advocates argued for garments that supported the body rather than constricted it, that encouraged health rather than undermined it. They championed simpler styles, fewer layers, and fabrics that breathed. It was a slow, incremental fight, chipping away at centuries of ingrained aesthetic and social conditioning, advocating for clothing that respected the female body, rather than attempting to reshape it into an impossible ideal. These movements, though often slow to gain widespread acceptance, represented crucial, incremental changes that paved the way for future freedoms. Each small concession, a slightly looser corset, a marginally shorter skirt, the acceptance of tailored jackets, was a victory against the entrenched power of fashion and the patriarchal control it represented. The dress reform movement was not just about clothes. It was about bodily autonomy, about health, and about women's right to define their own image, independent of stifling societal dictates. It was a quiet revolution, fought with needles and thread, but with profound implications for the future of female liberation. The dress reform movement wasn't just a separate fashion eccentricity. It was deeply intertwined with the burgeoning feminist movement of the era. Early feminists recognized, with chilling clarity, the profound connection between restrictive clothing and women's broader subordination. They understood that the corset, the voluminous skirts, and the entire aesthetic apparatus were not merely fashion trends, but deliberate, physical manifestations of patriarchal control, designed to keep women literally and figuratively in their place. For them, breaking free from these sartorial chains was an essential step towards breaking free from all other chains. Leading suffragettes and women's rights advocates often made conscious, powerful rejections of traditional beauty standards as a political statement. Figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, titans of the early feminist movement, weren't just fighting for the right to vote, they were fighting for the right to breathe, to move, and to control their own bodies. They understood that a woman physically incapacitated by her clothing was also a woman politically and socially incapacitated. To shed the corset was to declare bodily autonomy. To wear practical clothing was to assert one's right to engage with the world beyond the drawing room. It was a sartorial form of protest, a visual declaration of intent to dismantle the oppressive system. The fight for health and comfort over fashion and societal dictate became a central plank of their platform. They argued passionately that the debilitating effects of corsetry and heavy clothing, the respiratory problems, the organ damage, the chronic pain, were not just personal misfortunes, but systemic tools of oppression. A healthy, mobile body was a prerequisite for an active, engaged citizen, and if women were to participate fully in society, their clothing needed to facilitate, not hinder, their physical capabilities. They articulated the profound truth that a woman could not truly be free until she was free within her own skin, unburdened by garments designed to break her. Predictably, these women were perceived as unfeminine, radical, and even unsexed for their clothing choices. Their rejection of restrictive fashion was seen as an attack on womanhood itself, a dangerous abandonment of their prescribed roles. Critics used their sensible clothing as evidence of their moral and social deviance, dismissing their political arguments by attacking their appearance. Imagine the sheer audacity of being told your political opinions are invalid because you dare to wear a comfortable dress. But these feminists understood the game, and they used their defiance of fashion norms as a powerful visual symbol of their broader fight for equality, demonstrating that a woman could be both intelligent and uncorseted, active and, yes, still a woman. The legacy of these early feminists and dress reformers cannot be overstated. Their brave efforts laid the ideological groundwork for future generations of women to demand greater bodily autonomy and freedom in dress. While the battle was long and arduous, and fashion continued its dance of restriction and liberation for decades to come, these women struck the initial, critical blows against the tyranny of Victorian beauty, ensuring that the conversation about women's bodies, their health, and their freedom would continue, slowly but inexorably, towards a more enlightened future. As the Victorian era approached its twilight, a different kind of rebellion against rigid Victorian strictures began to surface, this time from the artistic and literary avant-garde, the aesthetic movement. This wasn't about women's rights explicitly, but it did offer a curious, almost parallel, rejection of the prevailing fashion and beauty ideals, albeit often replacing them with another set of equally specific and, for the average woman, still utterly unattainable aesthetic demands. Figures like Oscar Wilde, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and various artistic circles championed a backlash against the stifling formality, the industrial ugliness, and the moralistic hypocrisy of mainstream Victorian society. They yearned for beauty, for art, for a more naturalistic and flowing aesthetic in art, life, and, crucially, dress. This movement specifically and emphatically rejected the corset, seeing it as an unnatural, deforming contraption that imprisoned the body and stifled genuine beauty. They sought inspiration in earlier historical periods, particularly the medieval and early Renaissance, for more graceful, unconstructed silhouettes. The result was aesthetic dress. Loose, flowing gowns, often made of soft, natural fabrics like silk, linen, or velvet, that draped elegantly over the body rather than reshaping it. These dresses, often inspired by classical or medieval styles, were worn without corsets, allowing for unprecedented freedom of movement and natural breathing. The silhouette was long, graceful, and unconstricted, emphasizing an ethereal, artistic beauty. Imagine suddenly being allowed to move your arms freely and take a full, deep breath. It was a revolutionary feeling for those who adopted it. It was a visual declaration that beauty could exist without suffering, that grace could be inherent, not engineered. But here's the delicious irony. While the aesthetic movement rejected one set of strictures, it often replaced them with another, equally specific and, for the vast majority, still class-bound and unattainable aesthetic. The aesthetic woman was meant to embody a languid, poetic beauty, often with long, flowing hair, unburdened by rats and pins, a pale complexion, but achieved naturally, or so they claimed, through artistic sensitivity, not lead paint, and a serene, contemplative demeanor. This was an ideal that still required leisure, a certain artistic sensibility, and often an income that allowed for bespoke, flowing gowns and a life free from mundane toil. It was a beauty of artistic cultivation, not accessible to the masses. So, while offering a breath of fresh air, quite literally without the corset, the aesthetic movement's ideal was still very much an ideal, just a different one. The ethereal, or artistic woman was no less a constructed fantasy than the angel in the house. It simply shifted the goalposts from rigid architectural confinement to a more subtle yet equally demanding ideal of natural, artistic grace. It demonstrated that even in rebellion, society found new ways to define, categorize, and subtly control female appearance, ensuring that the pursuit of an impossible beauty, in one form or another, would continue to shape women's lives. As the calendar pages turned from the 19th to the 20th century, the suffocating grip of Victorian beauty began a slow, painful, yet ultimately irreversible shift. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic emancipation, but a gradual erosion, an easing of the iron bands, leading to the rise of a new, iconic ideal, the Gibson girl. She represented a step away from the fragile, fainting Victorian lady, but make no mistake, she was still impossibly elegant, still demanded a formidable silhouette, and still required a degree of bodily manipulation. The Gibson girl, popularized by the illustrations of Charles Dana Gibson, was the epitome of the new turn-of-the-century woman. She was active, athletic, or at least she projected an image of being so, confident, and possessing a healthy, almost vigorous beauty. Her figure was no longer the extreme S-bend. Instead, she favored a tall, graceful, curvaceous silhouette, often with a full, pouting bust and broad hips, yet still maintaining a relatively small waist. She was the picture of healthy American femininity, a stark contrast to her delicate Victorian predecessors. But while she seemed to embody a more natural ideal, her curves and posture were still often carefully crafted. Crucially, the era saw the loosening of corsetry, though certainly not its complete abandonment. The S-bend, or straight-front corset, which emerged around the turn of the century, still cinched the waist but pushed the bust forward and the hips backward, creating a monobosom and a distinctive forward-leaning posture. It was less about extreme waist reduction and more about creating a long, flowing line, minimizing the stomach while accentuating the bust and hips. It offered a marginal increase in comfort and breathing room compared to the tight lacing of the mid-Victorian era, but it was still a formidable garment, still restrictive, and still very much a cornerstone of the fashionable silhouette. This new ideal also coincided with the growing acceptance of women in some sports and public roles. Cycling, tennis, and even some forms of athletics gained popularity, and women were increasingly seen engaging in these activities, albeit often in specially designed and still restrictive sporting attire. Women began to enter professions like teaching, nursing, and clerical work, requiring a greater degree of practicality and mobility in their clothing. These societal shifts demanded a more functional female form, subtly pushing fashion away from extreme incapacitation towards a more, relatively, active aesthetic. However, despite these welcome changes, the lingering legacy of Victorian beauty persisted. The core ideas of female adornment, the emphasis on external appearance, and the underlying mechanisms of control and unattainable perfection merely evolved. The corset might have loosened, but it was still there. The focus shifted from extreme delicacy to healthy curves, but these curves were still idealized, still often achieved through artifice, and still unattainable for many. The Gibson girl, while representing progress, was still an ideal, a carefully constructed image of feminine perfection that, in its own way, continued to place immense pressure on women to conform. The battle for true bodily autonomy was far from over. It was merely entering a new, slightly less brutal, but no less demanding phase. So, we've journeyed through the labyrinthine, whalebone-reinforced corridors of Victorian beauty, a 3-hour descent into a world where grace was forged in agony and elegance was bought with bodily harm. We've witnessed the brutal impossibility of these standards, the relentless pressure to conform to an ideal that literally squeezed the life out of women, poisoned their systems, and twisted their bodies into unnatural forms. From the suffocating embrace of the corset, displacing organs and crushing ribs, to the lead-laced powders that slowly drove women insane, to the deliberate cultivation of fragility and illness, the Victorian era truly took the concept of beauty is pain and elevated it to a high art form of self-destruction. It was a time when looking perfect meant sacrificing comfort, health, vitality, and ultimately, often life itself, all for an illusion, a fleeting, superficial image of ideal femininity. And now for the dark, sarcastic reflection. How much was truly sacrificed for this illusion? Everything. Women sacrificed their breath, their digestion, their reproductive health, their mobility, their energy, their physical comfort, and very often their sanity and their lives. They became living advertisements for societal expectation, human sculptures crafted by unseen hands, their bodies a testament to a patriarchal system that demanded outward perfection as a symbol of inward subservience. It wasn't just physical pain, it was the psychological torment of constant judgment, the anxiety of never being enough, the profound lack of agency over one's own body and destiny. The Victorian beautiful woman was a monument to human endurance, yes, but also a chilling symbol of enforced conformity, a silent scream beneath layers of lace and dignity. But here's where the historical lens sharpens, because while we might scoff at arsenic wafers and 18-inch waists, connecting Victorian ideals to modern beauty pressures reveals a rather uncomfortable truth. The forms change, the specific technologies evolve, but the underlying mechanisms of control and the pursuit of unattainable perfection persist. We no longer wear corsets that crush our organs, but we have waist trainers, filters that distort our faces, and cosmetic surgeries that promise to sculpt us into an ideal that's still largely manufactured. We don't use lead paint, but we have a multi-billion-dollar beauty industry relentlessly pushing products and procedures designed to fix perceived flaws, promising impossible transformations. The goalposts have shifted, but the game is often still the same: conform, transform, or be found wanting. The ongoing struggle for body autonomy and self-acceptance, therefore, is not merely a modern phenomenon, it's a direct descendant of these historical battles. The Victorian woman fought, often silently, against the physical and psychological shackles of her era's beauty standards. Her fight, however hidden, laid groundwork for the dress reformers and early feminists who dared to speak out, to demand a world where a woman's worth wasn't dictated by the size of her waist or the pallor of her skin. Our battles today against photoshopped perfection, unrealistic body ideals, and the relentless pressure to optimize every inch of ourselves are continuations of their struggle. We look back at their extreme sacrifices and, perhaps, see a distorted mirror of our own, often unhealthy obsessions. So here's a final sarcastic thought, a gentle reminder that sometimes history's boring bits hold the most horrifying truths, and a good night's sleep might be the only escape from the endless demands of beauty. Next time you slip into something comfortable, or perhaps dare to go out without a full face of natural makeup, spare a thought for your Victorian forebears. They paid a steeper price for their fashion than you can possibly imagine, often with their very lives. And who knows, maybe their suffering will make you appreciate your yoga pants just a little bit more. Or not. History, after all, doesn't care if you're comfortable. It just demands its stories be told, however painfully true. If you've managed to stay awake through this descent into historical sartorial hell, congratulations. Your endurance is almost Victorian in its fortitude. Consider subscribing, or don't. History doesn't care, but I confess my ego might.